Long before Sparta became a military power, the Eurotas Valley shaped the possibilities of life in Laconia. Across the southern Peloponnese, the region later known as Laconia rests between mountain ranges that form a protective, almost isolated basin. To the west rise the massive Taygetos Mountains, a jagged wall of stone that separates the interior from Messenia. To the east stand the lower but equally rugged Parnon Range, descending sharply toward the Aegean. Between them lies the Eurotas Valley, a fertile corridor carved by the slow, persistent flow of the Eurotas River. In antiquity, this valley offered the most arable land in the region, shaping human settlement patterns long before Sparta emerged as a political community. Archaeology suggests that these environmental foundations, abundance in some seasons, harsh limits in others, framed the development of a society famed for discipline, hierarchy, and restraint. The earliest human presence in Laconia dates to the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE. Small agrarian communities established themselves along the Eurotas and within its surrounding foothills, leaving behind pottery fragments, simple structures, and burial sites that show continuity with cultures across the southern Greek mainland. These communities practiced mixed agriculture, grain cultivation where the soil was deep, animal husbandry along the uplands, and gathering of olives and wild fruits. The region's climate, dry summers, mild winters, allowed for predictable cycles, yet the mountains surrounding Laconia created microclimates and limited expansion, encouraging settlement within small, defensible pockets of arable land. By the Middle and Late Bronze Age, circa 1700 to 1100 BCE, the landscape of Laconia entered a new era of complexity under Mycenaean influence. The Peloponnese was dominated by a network of palatial centers, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and although Laconia lacked a palace on the scale of these hubs, it hosted significant Mycenaean sites that reveal deep cultural integration. Amyclae, south of later Sparta, stands out as one of the region's most important prehistoric settlements. Excavations have uncovered large tumuli, elaborate pottery styles, and indications of considerable population density. Scholars believe that Amyclae may have served as a local administrative or ritual center during the Mycenaean period, its prominence foreshadowing the religious significance it would retain into historical times. Another key site, the Menelaean near modern-day Therapon, has yielded architectural remains and artifacts that point to a Mycenaean elite presence. The Menelaean sits atop a commanding hill overlooking the Eurotas Valley, offering panoramic views of the agricultural plain. Its strategic position suggests the existence of an early ruling class connected to the wider Mycenaean world. The site's later association with Menelaus and Helen in Greek mythology reflects how memory and archaeology often intersect, preserving a layered narrative of settlement, power, and cultural prestige. The valley itself, however, is the central player in Laconia's early development. Its fertile soils, renewed by river flooding and the erosion of mountain slopes, allowed for the cultivation of wheat, barley, and later olives. Access to fresh water supported both agriculture and livestock, while the mountains provided timber, game, and natural defenses. Importantly, Laconia opened onto the Laconian Gulf, giving its inhabitants access to maritime routes stretching across the southern Aegean. This combination of arable land, defensive terrain, and coastal connectivity shaped a region capable of supporting stable populations, yet prone to local rivalries over fertile patches of ground. The end of the Bronze Age brought dramatic changes. Around 1200 to 1100 BCE, Mycenaean palace systems across Greece collapsed. Whether due to internal conflict, migrations, environmental stresses, or a combination of factors, the highly centralized structures that once coordinated art, trade, and administration disappeared. In Laconia, this shift is visible in the abandonment of some Mycenaean sites and the transformation of others into smaller, less hierarchical settlements. Amyclae, for example, continued to be occupied but lost its earlier prominence, becoming a modest community centered around hearth-based social networks rather than elite architecture. This period of upheaval coincided with unprecedented mobility across the Peloponnese. Groups migrated, merged, and competed for territory, Some traditions speak of the arrival of Dorian populations into the region, though archaeological evidence remains debated. What is clear is that Laconia experienced both continuity and disruption. Old settlements persisted, but new identities and social structures began to form. Small communities clustered around defensible hills and fertile fields, forming the demographic foundation of what would eventually become the Spartan polis. Throughout this transitional era, geography continued to dictate possibilities. The enclosing mountains limited large-scale invasions, allowing local groups to consolidate power gradually. The Eurotas Valley, constrained yet fertile, supported the growth of a population that could sustain coordinated agricultural labor. Meanwhile, access to the coast ensured the flow of goods and ideas, keeping Laconia connected to wider Mediterranean networks even in times of instability. Over generations, these conditions nurtured a society capable of centralization, territorial expansion, and the creation of a distinctive civic identity. The evolution from Mycenaean settlements to the early communities of historical Laconia was gradual rather than abrupt. Archaeological evidence reveals cultural continuity in pottery styles, burial traditions, and agricultural practices, even as political systems transformed. It is within this blend of old and new, continuity and migration, adaptation and inheritance, that early Spartan identity would emerge. The region's geography, neither overly generous nor entirely forbidding, cultivated a society attuned to discipline, cooperation, and survival. The end of the Mycenaean world opened a new phase of migrations and social change across the Peloponnese. Between myth and archaeology lies the complex process that shaped early Spartan identity. The transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age in Laconia is traditionally framed through the lens of the so-called Dorian invasion, a narrative preserved in later Greek tradition. According to classical sources, a northern people known as the Dorians swept into the Peloponnese after the collapse of the Mycenaean palatial world, conquering territories and establishing new ruling elites. Embedded within this tradition is the story of the return of the Heraclidae, the notion that descendants of the hero Heracles reclaimed the lands that rightfully belonged to them. While these myths became integral to Spartan self-definition in later centuries, the archaeological evidence paints a more complex and gradual picture of population movement, cultural change, and the formation of new communities. Modern scholarship generally rejects the idea of a single, large-scale invasion. Instead, researchers emphasize a combination of smaller migrations, internal reorganization, and continuity from earlier populations. Linguistic evidence suggests that the dialect later spoken in Sparta, Doric Greek, was part of a broader linguistic family distributed across the Peloponnese, Crete, and parts of the southern Aegean. How this dialect spread remains debated. One possibility is that groups speaking a Doric dialect gradually entered the region during the centuries following the collapse of Mycenaean administrative centers. Another explanation is that earlier Mycenaean populations may have already contained dialectal variations that became more pronounced as central authority disappeared. In either case, the linguistic record supports gradual diffusion rather than sudden displacement. Archaeology reinforces this interpretation. Across Laconia, material culture from the 12th to the 10th centuries BC reveals shifts in pottery styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns, yet these changes do not align with the destruction layers one would expect from a sweeping invasion. Instead, evidence points to a period of decentralization and reconfiguration. Mycenaean sites such as the Menelaean and Amyclae remained inhabited, though often at reduced scale. Meanwhile, new settlement clusters appeared around the Eurotas Valley, indicating a redistribution of populations into smaller, defensible communities. Pottery from this period, particularly the transition toward proto-geometric styles, suggests influence from regions to the north and west, consistent with small-scale population movements and cultural exchange rather than mass replacement. The myth of the Heraclidae, however, served an important function in later Spartan ideology. By claiming descent from Heracles, Spartan kings linked their authority to a heroic past and framed their presence in Laconia as legitimate and divinely sanctioned. This narrative also connected Sparta to other Dorian communities, reinforcing shared identity across the Peloponnese. Yet its prominence in later texts does not mean it reflects historical events. Most historians view the Heraclides story as a retroactive explanation crafted to provide coherence to complex demographic processes. It blends genealogy, territorial claims, and cultural memory, offering a mythic origin for what archaeology shows to be a gradual and multifaceted transition. As the early Iron Age progressed, the scattered settlements of Laconia began to coalesce. By the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, several distinct villages emerged in the lower Eurotas Valley, forming the nucleus of what would later become the Spartan polis. These communities, Pitane, Missoa, Limnae, and Cynosura, occupied small but strategically positioned areas around the river. Each had access to arable land, fresh water, and defensible terrain, making them viable hubs for extended families and kin networks. Archaeological remains from these settlements include domestic structures, hearths, pottery assemblages, and early sanctuaries, indicating growing social and economic complexity. Pitane, located near the later site of the Spartan Acropolis, appears to have been one of the earliest and most influential of these villages. Its position allowed control over the northern approach to the Eurotas Valley, making it a natural focal point for emerging political authority. Missoa, situated to the east, developed around fertile plains and access routes toward the Parnon foothills. Limnae, meaning marshes, occupied lower ground near the river itself, indicative of communities adapted to seasonal water cycles and agricultural production. Cynosura, though less well understood archaeologically, appears in later tradition as one of the constituent villages of the early Spartan state, suggesting its integration into the developing political structure. The formation of these villages reflects not only demographic patterns but also cultural consolidation. Shared burial practices, pottery styles, and religious sites indicate increasing cohesion among the inhabitants of the valley. Shrines dedicated to local deities and ancestor cults began to emerge, providing communal spaces for ritual activity and social negotiation. Such practices were essential for building collective identity during a time when political authority remained decentralized. Over time, these cultural ties would help facilitate the unification of the villages into a single polis. The broader regional context further shaped early Laconian development. As other areas of Greece experienced similar shifts, most notably the rise of new communities in Attica, Argolis, and Euboea, interregional contact intensified. Trade routes along the Aegean coast re-established themselves after earlier disruptions, allowing for the movement of goods such as metals, ceramics, and textiles. Laconia participated in these networks, though not as extensively as some other regions. Nonetheless, imported items found in Laconian graves demonstrate that the inhabitants were connected to broader Mediterranean developments, absorbing external influences while maintaining distinct local traditions. By the end of the 10th century BCE, the foundational elements of early Sparta were in place. The population had settled into stable communities across the Eurotas Valley. Linguistic and cultural markers associated with Doric identity had become more pronounced. Mythic narratives had begun to shape collective memory and political ideology. And most importantly, the villages that would eventually merge to form the Spartan polis had established themselves as enduring centers of settlement and social organization. These early villages would soon consolidate into one of Greece's most distinctive political communities. The unification of scattered villages created the political foundation on which Sparta would rise. The emergence of the Spartan polis during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE marked one of the most consequential political transformations in early Greek history. What began as independent villages, Pitane, Missoa, Limnae, and Cynosura, gradually coalesced into a unified community occupying the central Eurotas Valley. Classical authors later referred to this process as synoecism, the joining of households into a single political entity, although they preserved few details about its precise sequence. Archaeological findings, combined with comparative study of early Greek state formation, suggest a slow consolidation shaped by shared religious practices, elite negotiations, defensive needs, and growing social cohesion. At the beginning of this period, Each village possessed its own social identity and local leadership. They occupied distinct zones around the Eurotas River and maintained their own ritual spaces and kinship groups. Yet these communities were not isolated. Pottery assemblages from domestic and burial contexts reveal consistent stylistic convergence by the 9th century BCE, indicating intensified interaction and shared craftsmanship traditions. The proximity of the villages, some only a short walk apart, made cooperation likely, particularly in agricultural production and seasonal religious activity. As populations expanded and resource demands increased, closer coordination became increasingly advantageous. Religion played a central role in this emerging unity. Among the earliest known common sanctuaries was the shrine of Artemis Orthia, situated near the boundary between several of the constituent villages. Excavations at the site have revealed continuous occupation from the geometric period onward, including votive offerings, figurines, and ritual paraphernalia that reflect a shared cult with broad participation. The sanctuary provided a neutral and symbolically powerful location where members of different communities gathered for festivals and rites. Common worship reinforced a collective identity that transcended village boundaries, laying the cultural groundwork for political integration. The role of Artemis Orthia as a unifying deity would continue well into the classical period, but its significance began during these formative centuries. Elite families also contributed to the consolidation process. While direct evidence for early aristocratic lineages is limited, later Spartan traditions speak of influential clans with ancestral claims in each village. These groups likely coordinated agricultural management, dispute resolution, and trade relations, providing an early framework for inter-village negotiation. As in other early Greek polis, elite cooperation helped stabilize governance and facilitate shared decision-making. The emergence of a dual kingship, a system unique to Sparta, may have its origins in these pre-Sinoisic arrangements. Although the classical Spartan kings trace their lineage to the Heraclidae, the institution itself may reflect an early compromise between powerful families seeking to balance authority and mitigate conflict. Archaeological evidence indicates that the built environment also changed during the Sinoicism. Domestic structures became more standardized across the Eurotas Valley, and certain areas developed more substantial architecture, hinting at emerging administrative or communal functions. The gradual concentration of settlement patterns toward central locations suggests the formation of a proto-urban core. This pattern is consistent with other regions of Greece undergoing similar transitions, such as Athens and Argos, where scattered agricultural communities aggregated over time into unified political centers. By the early 8th century BCE, the unified settlement known as Sparta had begun to distinguish itself from neighboring communities. Its population increased, partly through natural growth and partly through the incorporation of nearby hamlets and marginalized groups. A clearer hierarchy emerged between the central villages and the surrounding countryside. Evidence from regional sanctuaries and cemeteries indicates growing administrative coordination across the Laconian plain. The material culture of the period, especially pottery, metalwork, and religious offerings, shows increasing uniformity, signaling the emergence of a shared Spartan identity rooted in local traditions rather than external influence. This consolidation had political implications. While formal institutions such as the Gerousia and Apella would not fully develop until later, their precursors may have taken shape during this period. Collective decision-making likely occurred at assemblies held near shared sanctuaries or central open spaces. Administrative authority was probably distributed among leading families, who mediated disputes, organized festivals, and coordinated defense. The absence of monumental architecture from this era reflects the limited scale of political organization, yet it also suggests a society focused on functional cooperation rather than symbolic display. Regional pressures further encouraged unification. The fragmented communities of Laconia faced competition from other rising polis in the Peloponnese, particularly Argos and Tegea. Control over fertile land in the Eurotas Valley required coordinated defense, and shared political structures enhanced the capacity for collective action. The Sinoicism thus provided the stability needed to respond to external threats and to begin expanding influence beyond the immediate valley. Religious festivals continued to solidify unity. Excavations at Amyclae, the site of the cult of Apollo, reveal significant dedications from the 8th century BCE, suggesting that major regional gatherings occurred there. The combination of the Artemis Orthia and Amyclaean cults created a network of sacred spaces that linked the constituent villages, reinforcing shared identity through ritual rather than coercion. These cult centers also provided venues for social integration, marriage alliances, and political negotiation among elite families. By the end of the 8th century BCE, the Cenoicism had effectively created a single political community with increasing internal cohesion. The emergent polis of Sparta possessed distinct territorial boundaries, a growing population, and early administrative structures. Cultural practices became more standardized, elite networks more interconnected, and communal religious festivals more central. The foundations of later Spartan political organization, dual kingship, council deliberation, and communal decision-making, had begun to take shape, though they remained flexible and locally driven. The unification of the villages did not immediately produce the rigid institutions associated with classical Sparta. Instead, it established a framework within which later reforms could emerge. The consolidation created a stable platform for territorial expansion, particularly into Messenia, and for internal social reorganization. Shared identity and unified political authority enabled the community to undertake more ambitious projects and to confront external rivals from a position of increasing strength. By the close of this formative period, Sparta had transitioned from a cluster of settlements into a coherent polis with a distinct cultural and political identity. Its development followed patterns observable across early Greece, yet the particular combination of geography, religion, and elite cooperation produced a unique trajectory. The Cenoicism laid the essential groundwork for the transformations that would follow in the 7th century BCE, when the community began to codify its institutions and reshape its social structure. This unified community now required a stable constitutional and social framework. Few figures in Greek history are as influential yet uncertain as Lycurgus. The figure of Lycurgus occupies a central position in the Spartan historical tradition, yet almost every aspect of his life remains uncertain. Ancient authors present him as the architect of Sparta's institutions, its discipline, its laws, its communal structure, and its political system. However, the earliest surviving accounts were written centuries after the period in which he was said to have lived. This chronological distance complicates efforts to determine whether Lycurgus was a historical legislator, a composite cultural memory, or a symbolic figure created to explain gradual political developments. The question of his historicity, therefore, provides an essential starting point for understanding the origins of the Spartan constitution. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, offers one of the earliest detailed descriptions of Lycurgus. He situates the lawgiver in an indeterminate early period and credits him with the establishment of the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, as well as with reforms that limited royal authority. Yet Herodotus acknowledges uncertainty, noting that different communities preserved different stories about Lycurgus's ancestry and exploits. His account blends genealogical information, political analysis, and elements of heroic narrative. While Herodotus considered Lycurgus a real historical figure, he did not claim to know precise dates or biographical details. Xenophon, writing slightly later, presents a more idealized interpretation. His Constitution of the Lacedaemonians attributes the entirety of the Spartan system to Lycurgus, from the education of the young to the structure of the army and the role of the kings. Xenophon's admiration for Spartan discipline colors his representation, leading him to treat Lycurgus as the embodiment of rational political design. He frames the lawgiver not only as a legislator but also as a moral reformer who reshaped the character of the Spartan people. This perspective, while informative about classical attitudes, provides limited historical reliability due to its philosophical and didactic aims. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, provides the fullest surviving narrative of Lycurgus's life. However, his biography reflects the challenges of working with late and contradictory sources. Plutarch openly admits that traditions about Lycurgus differ widely, including disagreements about his lineage, travels, and the sequence of his reforms. His account incorporates anecdotes that appear more legendary than historical, such as Lycurgus traveling to Crete and Asia Minor to study foreign laws, or imposing his reforms only after receiving approval from Delphi. These stories illuminate how later generations imagined the origins of their institutions, but they do not supply firm chronological evidence. Taken together, the ancient sources demonstrate that Lycurgus functioned primarily as a foundational figure in Spartan collective memory. He represented the principle of order and continuity within a society that emphasized stability. The attribution of all fundamental laws to a single individual simplified the complex historical processes that shaped Spartan institutions. This kind of retrospective explanation is common in ancient traditions, where communities often traced their laws to a single founder to legitimize political authority and reinforce social cohesion. Modern scholarship approaches the figure of Lycurgus with caution. Historians generally agree that the reforms associated with him were not the product of a single moment or legislator. Instead, they emerged through a long process of institutional evolution in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. This period witnessed significant social, political, and military changes across Greece, including the development of the hoplite phalanx, the rise of codified law, and the consolidation of aristocratic power. Sparta's own expansion into Messenia, along with internal pressure caused by population growth and resource competition, created conditions that required systematic reorganization. The Lycurgan reforms, therefore, likely reflect a series of adjustments made over several generations in response to evolving challenges. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Material remains from early Sparta show no sudden shift in settlement patterns or economic structures that would indicate a single transformative event. Instead, developments such as the increasing uniformity of burial practices, the rise of communal sanctuaries, and the gradual standardization of weaponry reflect a slow progression toward greater social cohesion and militarization. These shifts align with broader patterns of state formation in archaic Greece, where institutions evolved incrementally through negotiation and adaptation. Some scholars propose that Lycurgus may represent an amalgamation of earlier leaders whose actions contributed to the creation of the Spartan system. Others argue that he is a later invention used to provide legitimacy to institutions whose origins were otherwise obscure. The lack of contemporary inscriptions or administrative documents from early Sparta makes definitive conclusions difficult. Nevertheless, the consensus views the Lycurgan narrative as a symbolic framework rather than as a literal historical account. The persistence of Lycurgus in Spartan tradition reveals important insights about how the Spartans understood their own political identity. By attributing their institutions to a single lawgiver, they emphasized continuity, divine approval, and the belief that their society was intentionally designed rather than gradually assembled. This perspective reinforced loyalty to the established order and discouraged innovation. It also allowed the Spartans to present their constitution as a product of deliberate rationality, contrasting themselves with other Greek states whose laws evolved through conflict or crisis. The debate over Lycurgus's historicity thus has broader implications for interpreting Spartan history. It highlights the challenges of separating myth from historical process and underscores the need for careful analysis of both archaeological and textual evidence. It also illustrates how communities construct narratives to explain their political structures, using legendary figures to embody foundational principles. By the time classical authors recorded the Lycurgan tradition, the Spartan constitution had already existed in recognizable form for centuries. The mythic narrative of its creation served as a retrospective explanation for institutions that had developed through long-term social evolution. Whether Lycurgus was a real individual, a composite figure, or an invention of later generations, the reforms attributed to him reflect genuine historical transformations. Regardless of the man's existence, the reforms attributed to him define the Spartan system. The Great Retra offered Spartans a blueprint for order, stability, and controlled power. The constitutional foundation of early Sparta is traditionally linked to the Great Retra, a term that appears in later Greek sources to describe an authoritative pronouncement attributed to Lycurgus. Plutarch preserves the fullest version, claiming that the Retra came from the Delphic oracle and laid out the structure of political authority in the early polis. Although the text survives only through much later quotations, modern scholarship generally places the origins of the institutions it describes in the 7th century BCE. The Retra is therefore best understood not as a single legislative act, but as the formalization of political arrangements that had already begun to take shape during the period of Cenoicism and early state consolidation. Plutarch's version of the Retra outlines several core elements of the Spartan constitution: the dual kingship, the gerousia of elders, the popular assembly known as the apella, and the requirement that important decisions be presented to the people. Each of these components played a specific role in balancing power among different segments of the community. The language of the preserved text suggests a system designed to prevent domination by any one group, creating a stable distribution of authority that reflected both social hierarchy and collective participation. While the Retra's divine origins served a legitimizing function in later tradition, its content aligns closely with political developments known to have occurred across Greece during the Archaic period. The dual kingship formed one of the most distinctive elements of the Spartan system. Two royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, shared power, each claiming descent from the heroic lineage of Heracles. This arrangement reduced the likelihood of unilateral monarchical authority and ensured that no single household could monopolize leadership. In practical terms, the kings performed military, religious, and judicial functions. They commanded armies in the field, conducted state sacrifices, and mediated certain legal disputes. Classical sources emphasize ceremonial and military aspects of the role, but early evidence suggests that the kings possessed broader authority before later institutions gradually constrained their power. The dual kingship therefore reflects a transition from tribal leadership structures to a more regulated constitutional framework. Alongside the kings stood the gerousia, a council of 28 elders, all over the age of 60, plus the two kings. This body functioned as a stabilizing force in Spartan political life. Its members were elected for life, reflecting the community's emphasis on seniority and experience. The gerousia acted as the primary deliberative and judicial authority, preparing proposals for the popular assembly and serving as a high court in major legal cases. According to the tradition preserved in the Retra, the creation of the gerousia marked a major shift toward institutional governance, distributing power among a broader elite rather than concentrating it in hereditary monarchs. Archaeological evidence of elite burials and votive offerings suggests that a recognized aristocratic class existed in Sparta from an early period, providing the social base from which geronts were selected. The apella, the assembly of Spartan male citizens, constituted the third major component of the constitutional structure. According to the Retra, the assembly held the authority to vote on proposals submitted by the kings and the gerousia. Although the scope of its power was limited compared to assemblies in other Greek polis, such as Athens, the apella nonetheless represented a mechanism for broader citizen participation in the political process. Its decisions were typically expressed by acclamation rather than by counted ballots. Plutarch reports that, if the assembly distorted a proposal, the gerousia retained the right to set aside the decision, a clause that underscores the primacy of elite oversight in the constitutional system. The assembly's function therefore illustrates the balance between popular involvement and aristocratic control. One of the most debated institutions in Spartan constitutional history is the ephorate, the board of 5 annually elected magistrates. The ephors do not appear in the earliest description of the Retra, leading some scholars to argue that their authority developed later, perhaps in the 7th or 6th century BCE. Herodotus and Xenophon depict the ephors as powerful overseers with broad administrative, judicial, and supervisory functions. They convened the assembly, monitored the kings, managed foreign envoys, and enforced discipline across the community. The ephorate ultimately became one of the most influential organs of the Spartan state, but its absence from the early Retra suggests that its rise was gradual rather than foundational. Archaeological evidence provides partial support for this evolutionary interpretation. The 7th century BCE in Sparta was marked by significant social and military developments, including the First Messenian War and subsequent territorial consolidation. These events would have required enhanced administrative coordination, potentially contributing to the creation or expansion of a phoric authority. The gradual formalization of communal institutions, visible in dedications at sanctuaries, changes in burial practices, and the increasing standardization of military equipment, indicates a broader institutional maturation rather than a sudden legislative transformation. The Great Retra thus reflects a constitutional order that combined hereditary, aristocratic, and popular elements in a structured hierarchy. The dual kingship provided continuity and religious legitimacy. The Gerousia offered aristocratic deliberation, the Apella ensured citizen participation, and the later Ephors supplied day-to-day administration and oversight. This distribution of functions created a system in which power was diffused among multiple institutions, limiting internal conflict and enabling the community to respond effectively to external pressures. It also allowed Sparta to maintain a stable political identity during periods of territorial expansion and social reorganization. Modern scholars emphasize that the Retra should not be interpreted as a comprehensive constitution in the modern sense. Instead, it codified practices that had already emerged through custom and collective agreement. The attribution of these arrangements to a single pronouncement, whether delivered by a lawgiver or an oracle, served as a narrative device for later generations seeking to explain the origins of their political order. The Retra represents a formal acknowledgement of a political system whose foundations had been laid through long-term social evolution. The significance of the Retra lies in its articulation of a political structure that would remain remarkably stable for centuries. Its emphasis on shared authority, limited monarchy, and collective deliberation shaped the development of Spartan governance throughout the archaic and classical periods. It also provided the constitutional framework within which the distinctive Spartan social system would later develop, defining the relationship between the state and its citizens. A constitution alone could not define Sparta. Its social system made it distinct. Spartan society rested on a sharply stratified structure that shaped every aspect of life. Sparta's rise as a dominant power in the Peloponnese depended on a social hierarchy that allocated rights, responsibilities, and economic functions with unusual rigidity. Ancient authors such as Herodotus, Xenophon, and Aristotle consistently highlight the degree to which Spartan institutions were organized around distinctions of status. Archaeological evidence from Laconia, ranging from settlement patterns to grave assemblages, reinforces the view that the social divisions recorded in literary sources had deep structural roots. This tripartite system, Spartiates, Perioikoi, and Helots, created the foundation upon which Spartan militarism and governance rested. The Spartiates, or homoioi equals, formed the citizen elite. Literary tradition indicates that full citizenship required descent from the original Dorian settlers and successful completion of the agoge, the state educational system. The emphasis on shared training, communal messes, syssitia, and equal land allotments, kleroi, reflects a political ideal of uniformity among an elite minority. Archaeologists note that the absence of lavish grave goods in classical Laconia aligns with the reported ideological commitment to austerity and equality among full citizens. One interpretive insight is that these practices reinforced cohesion within the ruling class, minimizing internal competition and enabling the group to function as a unified military and political core. Beneath the image of egalitarian citizens stood a reality of demographic scarcity. By the 5th century BCE, ancient testimonies such as those of Aristotle suggest a decline in Spartiate numbers, caused by inheritance concentration, wartime casualties, and increasingly strict citizenship criteria. Modern demographic estimates indicate that while early Sparta may have had several thousand full citizens, the number declined drastically by the classical period. This reduction enhanced the vulnerability of the citizen body but simultaneously increased the reliance on subordinate populations to sustain the Spartan system. The perioikoi, meaning dwellers around, occupied a unique intermediate status. They were free but non-citizen inhabitants dispersed throughout Laconia and Messenia in autonomous communities. Their presence is indicated archaeologically by settlements with material culture distinct from the central Spartan area, including craft production facilities and commercial installations. According to literary sources, perioikoi served as traders, craftsmen, and shipbuilders, roles that full citizens were discouraged from performing due to ideological commitments to military service. A key analytical insight is that the perioikoi functioned as a crucial economic buffer. They connected isolationist Sparta to wider Aegean networks without forcing the elite to abandon their martial identity. Despite their lack of political rights, the perioikoi served in the Spartan army and provided essential manpower in campaigns. Their obligations underline another interpretive point. The Spartan state succeeded not because of the Spartiates' numbers alone, but because it mobilized a broader coalition of dependent but cooperative communities. This layered integration of free but subordinate populations allowed Sparta to project power across the Peloponnese while maintaining the ideological purity of its core elite. At the base of the hierarchy stood the Helots, an agricultural servile population whose labor was indispensable to the Spartan economy. Ancient sources, particularly Thucydides and Herodotus, emphasize the Helots' numerical superiority over the Spartiate citizenry. Archaeological surveys of rural Messenia reveal extensive farming systems consistent with large-scale labor organization, supporting the literary description of Helots as bound cultivators attached to state-owned land allotments. Their production sustained the Syssitia and ensured the material foundation needed for the citizens to dedicate themselves to military training. The origins of Helotage remain debated. Some scholars argue for a continuity of pre-Dorian populations reduced to servitude, especially in Messenia after the Spartan conquest in the 8th to 7th centuries BCE. Others suggest a more complex mixture of subjugated groups assimilated over time. What is clear from evidence such as Tertius poetry is that conflict with the Messenians during the First and Second Messenian Wars played a decisive role in defining the institution. These wars strengthened the Spartan need for a coercive mechanism to control a large and potentially rebellious labor force. The cryptia, a controversial practice described by Plutarch, may have been one such mechanism, though modern scholars debate its actual function. The economic role of the Helots cannot be overstated. They cultivated barley, olives, and grapes, delivered fixed dues to their Spartan masters, and maintained the agricultural surplus required for sustained military readiness. Spartiate wealth derived largely from Helot labor rather than personal industry. This dynamic illustrates one of the central paradoxes of the Spartan system. The elite claimed equality among themselves, yet their status depended on the deep inequality produced by a labor force that lacked political agency or freedom. The political implications of Helotage also shaped Spartan foreign policy. Thucydides reports that Sparta was often cautious in warfare due to fear of Helot revolt when the army was deployed abroad. This constraint explains decisions such as the refusal to send large contingents early in the Peloponnesian War and the controversial recall of Brasidas' Helot volunteers with promises of freedom. These incidents demonstrate how the internal structure of society exerted direct influence on strategic calculations. Helot resistance, although limited by coercive oversight, is attested through reports of uprisings, especially in Messenia. The most notable occurred after the Great Earthquake of 464 BCE, which weakened Spartan authority and emboldened the local population. Archaeological datings of destruction layers in Messenia correspond reasonably with literary accounts of the revolt. The subsequent military campaigns highlight the extent to which Spartan domestic stability depended on continuous suppression of Helot unrest. By integrating Spartiates, perioikoi, and Helots into a single system, Sparta constructed a rigid hierarchy that maximized its military capabilities. The elite citizens produced cohesion and political leadership. The perioikoi provided economic specialization and auxiliary manpower. The Helots furnished agricultural output and demographic weight. Each group was necessary for the functioning of the whole. The system was stable only so long as its components remained in balance. By the time this social order fully developed, Sparta possessed the internal structure required to support further territorial expansion. The struggle for Messenia reshaped Sparta's demographic and economic foundations. The First Messenian War, traditionally dated between approximately 740 and 720 BCE, marked the earliest large-scale territorial expansion of Sparta and established the long-term structure of Spartan society. Ancient accounts, especially those of Pausanias, provide the main narrative framework, although modern scholarship treats these sources cautiously due to their late composition. Archaeological surveys in Messenia, particularly in regions around Mount Ithome and the Peloponnese Valley, offer independent evidence of population displacement and settlement disruption during this period. Together, literary and material sources indicate a prolonged conflict that fundamentally altered both regions. The causes of the war were rooted in competition over land and resources. The fertile plains of Messenia contained some of the most productive agricultural terrain in the Peloponnese, and access to these lands offered a substantial economic advantage. According to early poetic sources such as Tertius, conflict emerged from disputes over boundaries and cattle raids, common triggers of intercommunal warfare in early Greece. However, the scale of the war suggests broader pressures. Population growth in Laconia and the consolidation of early Spartan political institutions likely increased demands for arable land. One interpretive insight is that the conflict reflects a transition from small-scale tribal disputes to organized territorial conquest motivated by systemic needs, rather than episodic violence. The early stages of the war appear to have involved a series of raids and counter-raids. Pausanias describes initial clashes near the border region of Dentheliatis, though these specific accounts cannot be fully verified. Archaeological evidence of fortified hilltops in both Laconia and Messenia suggests that communities prepared for prolonged hostilities. The construction and defense of such sites indicate organized military planning rather than spontaneous conflict. This shift corresponds with broader developments in early Greek warfare, including the emergence of hoplite tactics. Though scholars debate the exact timeline of hoplite formation, the dense, disciplined infantry described in Tertius' poetry implies that early Spartan forces were already moving toward a collective fighting style that emphasized cohesion and uniformity. The Messenians, according to literary sources, mounted a determined resistance. Pausanias recounts the role of King Aristodemus, who purportedly rallied the population and held out for several years at the fortified site of Mount Ithome. While the specifics of this narrative are difficult to validate, excavations around Ithome reveal signs of habitation disruption and possible destruction layers dating to the late 8th century BCE. These findings support the general conclusion that the region experienced sustained conflict consistent with a long siege or repeated attacks. An important analytical point is that the Messenians did not represent a loosely organized society. They appear to have had centralized leadership and strong communal identity, factors that prolonged the conflict. Spartan strategy during the war combined military pressure with efforts to isolate Messenian strongholds. The topography of the region, mountainous terrain surrounding small plains, made warfare slow and attritional. Control of passes and river valleys was essential. Although detailed accounts of tactical movements are lacking, the eventual Spartan victory suggests a capacity to maintain long-term campaigns, supported by the developing organizational structures of the Spartan state. The support of the Perioikoi and allied communities in Laconia may have provided additional manpower and logistical assistance. This underscores a larger interpretive insight. Early Spartan expansion required the participation of dependent populations whose roles in warfare were crucial even before the full maturation of the classical Spartan system. The turning point of the war, according to Pausanias, came with the fall of Mount Ithome after a prolonged siege. The narrative includes legendary elements, such as prophecies and heroic suicides, which complicate historical reconstruction. Nonetheless, the archaeological record indicates significant population displacement in the Peloponnese Valley in the decades following the conflict. Many small settlements were abandoned or reorganized, consistent with mass subjugation and redistribution of land. The convergence between these material changes and literary descriptions strengthens the view that Spartan victory was decisive and transformative. The aftermath of the war brought extensive reorganization of Messenian territory. Ancient sources state that the Spartans imposed a system of servitude on the local population, making them helots, a status unique within the Greek world. While the precise mechanisms of this transformation remain debated, there is broad agreement that the conquest established a large labor force tied to newly allocated landholdings. Agricultural production in Messenia increased substantially under Spartan control, as evidenced by later classical references to the region as the economic backbone of the Spartan state. Archaeological studies of rural Messenia reveal a pattern of estate-centered agriculture consistent with exploitation by an elite ruling class. This economic transformation had direct political implications. The acquisition of Messenian labor and land provided the material foundation for the institutions attributed to the Lycurgan reforms. With a substantial enslaved population sustaining agriculture, Sparta could maintain a citizen body dedicated to military training. This link between conquest and institutional development illustrates a critical interpretive insight. The Spartan social and political model did not emerge independently but grew from the economic conditions established through territorial expansion. Military success and social organization were mutually reinforcing components of early Spartan power. The war also transformed the demographic balance of the Peloponnese. Messenia's incorporation into the Spartan sphere doubled the territory under Spartan control and increased the size of the subordinate population relative to full citizens. This demographic inversion, citizens ruling over a much larger servile population, created long-term security concerns. Ancient historians often emphasize the Spartans' fear of Helot revolt, a sentiment rooted in the conditions created by the First Messenian War. From this period onward, Spartan foreign policy and military commitments were shaped by the constant need to maintain internal stability. Culturally, the war left lasting impressions in both regions. For Sparta, Tertius' martial poetry reflects an emerging ideology that framed obedience, endurance, and collective discipline as civic virtues. These values were reinforced through references to the Messenian struggle, which served as both a warning and a justification for rigid social cohesion. For the Messenians, the memory of the conflict survived in exile, diaspora communities, and later revolts. Although their voices are less well preserved, archaeological evidence of abandoned settlements and material discontinuities attests to the scale of displacement. By the end of the First Messenian War, Sparta had secured control over a vast and fertile region, anchoring its rise to power in the Peloponnese. The acquisition of land and labor enabled the state to pursue further consolidation and institutional development, setting the stage for future conflicts and reforms. Victory only deepened the need for further consolidation. Renewed revolt forced Sparta to refine its military and social systems. The Second Messenian War, traditionally dated between approximately 685 and 668 BCE, represented the most significant internal challenge Sparta faced during the Archaic period. While ancient sources, principally Pausanias, Tertius, and later chronographers, provide narratives shaped by legend, the underlying historical reality is clear. The Messenian population, subjected to servitude after the First Messenian War, mounted a sustained revolt that threatened the foundations of Spartan control. Archaeological data from Messenia, including changes in settlement patterns and defensive relocations, support the view that the conflict had considerable regional impact. This second major uprising forced the Spartans to adapt militarily, socially, and politically, laying developmental groundwork for the classical Spartan system. The origins of the conflict lay in accumulated tensions following several decades of Spartan rule. Helot labor extraction in Messenia had intensified, and the demand for agricultural surplus likely placed increasing burdens on local populations. Tertius' surviving fragments, though framed in Spartan ideology, indicate a climate of fear and instability. He describes renewed strife in the land, suggesting that the revolt was neither sudden nor isolated. The broader geopolitical context also contributed. The late 7th century BCE was a period of rising regional competition in the Peloponnese, and internal revolts threatened Spartan security at a time when the polis was still consolidating its institutional structures. Ancient narratives highlight the figure of Aristomenes, a Messenian leader presented as a heroic and almost mythic commander. Pausanias credits him with repeated victories and daring raids deep into Laconian territory, including assaults on Spartan positions. While these accounts are embellished, they reflect a historical truth. Messenian resistance was organized, persistent, and coordinated across multiple fronts. Archaeological surveys at sites such as Ira, a fortified refuge described by Pausanias, suggest occupation levels consistent with the defensive stronghold in the late 7th century BCE. These material indications support the view that the Messenians mounted a long-term, strategically structured resistance rather than sporadic uprisings. For Sparta, the war demanded a more sophisticated and sustained military response than the earlier conflict. The need to suppress a rebellion over difficult terrain required heightened discipline and coordination, likely accelerating the refinement of hoplite warfare. Tertius elegies, composed during this period, stress unity, cohesion, and unwavering commitment to the phalanx, values that would later define the classical Spartan military ethos. His poetic exhortations provide some of the earliest explicit references to military training regimes and collective discipline. One interpretive insight is that the pressures of prolonged internal conflict served as a catalyst for codifying martial practices that previously existed only in embryonic form. The conflict also exposed vulnerabilities in Spartan governance. The dual kingship and the Gerousia provided strategic leadership, but the scale of the revolt necessitated broader civilian mobilization. Some scholars argue that this period witnessed an expansion of the Ephorate's authority, allowing for more flexible administrative decision-making during wartime. Although direct evidence is sparse, the development of the Ephorate into a powerful oversight body aligns chronologically with the demands of the late 7th century. The war thus may have played a key role in formalizing the political mechanisms that enabled Sparta to adapt efficiently to crises. The Messenians' strongest resistance centered on the fortified position at Ira, located on the upper Neda River. Pausanias describes it as the final bastion of rebellion, resisting Spartan assaults for more than a decade. While such durations are difficult to verify, the archaeological record confirms that the area shows evidence of habitation, fortification, and eventual abandonment consistent with violent conflict. The strategic choice of Ira illustrates the geography of resistance. Rugged terrain provided natural defense advantages, forcing the Spartans into protracted siege operations. This terrain-driven stalemate contributed to Spartan reforms in supply management, reinforcement procedures, and long-term campaign stability. Tertius' martial poetry suggests that the war placed considerable strain on Spartan cohesion. He emphasizes the necessity of collective morale, obedience to commanders, and the shame associated with desertion. Such themes point to internal divisions or wavering commitment within the Spartan ranks. The endurance required for lengthy campaigns, combined with the threat of Helot insurrection, demanded new levels of discipline. This supports the interpretive view that the war did not simply reinforce existing values but actively shaped the evolving Spartan ethos, especially the concepts of unwavering solidarity and subordination of individual interest to collective survival. The eventual Spartan victory, according to ancient accounts, followed the fall of Ira after a prolonged siege. Pausanias describes dramatic scenes of flight and diaspora among the Messenian population. While these narratives are stylized, settlement analysis across Western Messenia indicates widespread abandonment patterns in the late 7th century BCE, consistent with mass displacement. Some groups fled westward to the Ionian Islands or to Arcadia, while others were forcibly resettled in Laconia. The demographic consequences were substantial. Sparta gained a dramatically enlarged Helot labor force, and the ratio of Helots to citizens increased further, institutionalizing a social imbalance that would shape the state's long-term trajectory. Following the war, the Spartans implemented stricter controls over the Messenian population. Measures included heightened surveillance, more frequent inspections, and institutional practices designed to reinforce social dominance. Later traditions about the Cryptia, the secretive youth patrol reputed to monitor and at times terrorize Helots, may have roots in the measures instituted after the Second Messenian War. Although the exact form and function of the Cryptia remain debated, its thematic alignment with this period supports the view that the revolt prompted intensified mechanisms of internal control. Economically, the consolidation of Messenia under firmer Spartan rule enabled the state to expand agricultural output. Land redistribution followed, with Messenian territories converted into state-managed allotments attributed to Spartan citizens. This system provided the material basis for the full-time military lifestyle of the Spartiates, allowing them to dedicate themselves to training while the Helots performed agricultural labor. The war thus completed the economic transformation begun in the first conflict, embedding forced labor as a structural component of Spartan society. Culturally, the war also left a lasting imprint. In Sparta, the memory of Messenian resistance was used to reinforce ideology concerning discipline, obedience, and preparedness. Tertius verses continued to be recited in later centuries, serving as both historical narrative and moral instruction. For the Messenians, collective memory persisted through diaspora communities and periodic revolts, shaping identity and fueling later conflicts during the classical period. By the end of the Second Messenian War, Sparta had secured its control over a critical region, further solidifying its position within the Peloponnese. The internal pressures of revolt had accelerated military, political, and social refinements that contributed to the emergence of the classical Spartan system. The subjugation of Messenia freed Sparta to direct its attention outward toward regional alliances, conflicts, and diplomatic structures. With Messenia subdued, Sparta turned outward. By the 6th century BCE, Sparta stood as the dominant land power of the Peloponnese. The consolidation of Spartan power during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE marked a fundamental shift in the political landscape of southern Greece. The suppression of the Messenian revolts allowed Sparta to concentrate its energies outward, initiating a series of diplomatic, military, and institutional developments that resulted in the formation of a regional alliance system, the Peloponnesian League. This process unfolded gradually and reflects the evolution of Spartan statecraft from internal stabilization to external influence. Literary sources such as Herodotus and Thucydides, combined with epigraphic evidence and archaeological surveys, provide a multifaceted view of how Sparta built a durable network of alliances centered on hegemonic leadership. The earliest stages of regional consolidation followed immediately after the Second Messenian War. The Spartans, now controlling a vast territory and a large servile population, required external stability to prevent renewed uprisings through outside intervention. Relations with neighboring polis therefore became a strategic priority. Corinth, located at the isthmus and commanding critical trade routes between central Greece and the Peloponnese, emerged as a vital early partner. The two states shared common interests, securing regional trade, containing Argive influence, and discouraging external threats from central Greece. Although formal alliance documentation from this early period is lacking, references in later sources indicate that Corinth aligned itself voluntarily with Sparta, suggesting mutual benefit rather than coercion. This association laid the groundwork for what would later become a more comprehensive league structure. While diplomatic relations strengthened with Corinth, Sparta continued to assert its influence through selective military engagements. The most significant of these conflicts occurred with Tegea, a city in central Arcadia. According to Herodotus, Sparta initially suffered defeats while attempting to subjugate the Tegeans. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of strong defensive installations in Arcadia, indicating that the region was capable of resisting external pressure. The turning point came when Sparta shifted from efforts at direct domination to a more pragmatic model of regional leadership. After a period of stalemate, Sparta negotiated terms that recognized Tegean autonomy while bringing the city into a cooperative relationship. This transition reflects an interpretive insight. Spartan hegemony in the Peloponnese did not arise primarily through conquest, but through a balance of military reputation and diplomatic flexibility. The evolving network of alliances gradually coalesced into what modern scholars term the Peloponnesian League. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BCE, offers the earliest explicit references to its structure, although the League's formation likely occurred over several decades during the 6th century BCE. The League operated as a Symmachia, a mutual defense alliance, where each member retained internal autonomy but pledged military support under Spartan leadership. Sparta served as the permanent hegemon, directing League campaigns and providing the strategic framework for collective action. This system gave Sparta unprecedented influence while minimizing administrative burdens. The League's bilateral structure, in which each city allied directly with Sparta rather than forming a unified council, ensured that no member could challenge Spartan dominance. This period also saw Sparta engage in more frequent arbitration and diplomatic intervention. In disputes across the Peloponnese, member states increasingly turned to Sparta for mediation. This role is illustrated in traditions concerning the settlement of boundary conflicts, particularly those between Arcadian communities. Although specific cases recorded in later sources may include embellishments, the general pattern is supported by epigraphic evidence indicating that Sparta was recognized as a stabilizing regional authority. The adoption of diplomatic leadership, alongside military strength, enhanced Sparta's reputation as an arbiter capable of preserving order. Relations with Argos, Sparta's long-standing rival, also played a critical role in the shaping of Peloponnesian hegemony. The Battle of Hyzea, c. 669 BCE, in which Argos claimed a significant victory, demonstrated early limitations in Spartan expansion. However, by the 6th century BCE, the balance of power had shifted. The Spartan conquest of Sinuria, a disputed frontier region, illustrates how gradual territorial adjustments contributed to long-term strategic advantage. Later conflicts, including a notable confrontation at Thyrea, further reduced Argive influence. Although Argos remained independent, its diminished power allowed Sparta to consolidate control over the central and southern Peloponnese. Throughout the 6th century, Sparta also engaged in broader Hellenic diplomacy. The city played a central role in suppressing tyrannies in other Greek states, reflecting its ideological preference for oligarchic governance. The most notable example is Sparta's involvement in the expulsion of the Pisistratid tyrants from Athens, an episode documented by both Herodotus and later Athenian sources. Although Sparta's intervention ultimately failed to shape Athenian governance in its favor, the attempt demonstrates a growing willingness to influence regions beyond the Peloponnese. The interpretive significance of this development lies in its demonstration of Spartan confidence. A state once preoccupied with internal security now projected authority across the Greek world. Internal factors also underpinned the development of Spartan hegemony. The expansion of the Peloponnesian League required organizational coherence within Sparta itself. The Gerousia and Ephyrae played increasingly prominent roles in managing external affairs. The Ephors, in particular, acted as the executive agents of foreign policy, coordinating treaties, alliance maintenance, and diplomatic correspondence. This shift indicates that Spartan political evolution continued well into the 6th century BCE, adapting to the demands of interstate leadership. While the ideological foundations of the Spartan system emphasized stability and continuity, institutional refinements were ongoing and responsive to external pressures. The Tegean settlement and subsequent alliance marked a turning point in the articulation of Spartan strategy. Instead of pursuing direct annexation, Sparta focused on cultivating obedience and cooperation among autonomous states. This approach reduced military expenditure, preserved stability, and maintained a favorable balance of power. The League system allowed Sparta to mobilize substantial forces in wartime, as member cities contributed contingents under Spartan command. The flexibility and durability of the Peloponnesian League would later prove decisive during major conflicts with Persia and Athens. By the late 6th century BCE, Sparta had become the preeminent land power of the Peloponnese. Its alliances encircled the region, its reputation deterred challenges, and its capacity to mobilize military forces exceeded that of any neighboring state. This hegemonic structure was not monolithic. Rather, it was a network maintained through a combination of diplomacy, military prestige, and shared strategic interests. The consolidation of regional control provided Sparta with the security needed to sustain its distinctive social and military system, which depended on stability both at home and abroad. The rise of Spartan hegemony in the Peloponnese thus reflects a complex interplay of military engagements, diplomatic activity, institutional adaptation, and strategic calculation. The Peloponnesian League emerged not as a formal imposition but as a collective structure shaped by mutual needs and Spartan leadership. By the dawn of the classical period, this system positioned Sparta as a central actor in Greek interstate affairs and laid the foundation for later confrontations with external powers. Strength abroad required discipline at home. A new system was emerging. This section examines the origins, structure, and stages of the Spartan agoge, drawing on literary testimony, Xenophon, Plutarch, comparative evidence from other Greek polis, and modern scholarship. It outlines the progression from childhood to adulthood, the role of the paid nomos, group discipline, ritualized hardship, literacy, music, and the cultivation of solidarity within age cohorts. It evaluates conflicting interpretations, whether the agoge was primarily military or socio-political, and situates the system within Sparta's broader ideological aims: obedience, endurance, and unity. The agoge shaped citizens through discipline, cohesion, and controlled hardship. This training produced the hoplite system that defined Sparta. This section analyzes the full hoplite panoply and the tactical system that defined Spartan land warfare at its classical height. It outlines the components of the standard equipment set: helmet types, Corinthian, later pilos, cuirasses, bronze bell cuirass to linothorax, greaves, spear, doru, and the central defensive element, the aspis shield. Archaeological finds from Laconia and broader Greece support reconstructions of materials, weight, and artistic styles. The section then explores hoplite tactics: the phalanx formation, the emphasis on cohesion and uniform movement, the unique cadence of Spartan marching to flute music, and the famed emphasis on group discipline. Shield imagery, including the late adoption of the lambda emblem, is discussed as a symbolic tool of collective identity. Finally, the section evaluates how Spartan hoplite warfare differed from other Greek traditions, not necessarily in equipment, but in training intensity, drill precision, and institutional cohesion. The Spartan hoplite became a symbol of collective strength over individual glory. This disciplined force would soon face Persia. This section examines the multilayered command hierarchy that governed Spartan warfare from the archaic to classical periods. It begins with the dual kingship, outlining how each king possessed hereditary authority to lead armies, perform religious rituals, and serve as the highest-ranking commander, while also being constrained by Ephyrs and the Gerousia. It then explains the role of polemarchs, originally aristocratic war leaders who evolved into senior commanders sometimes equal in influence to the kings, particularly during large campaigns. The core of the system, the mora, a regimental unit of roughly 500 to 900 men, is explored as the building block of Spartan military organization. Discussion includes its subdivision into lochoi, Pentecostes, and enomotiae, each led by officers whose responsibility was to maintain cohesion and discipline. The section highlights the distinctive feature of mixed-age regiments, designed to combine seasoned veterans with younger soldiers to prevent experience gaps and ensure steady leadership throughout the ranks. Campaign logistics are treated as a defining strength of Spartan warfare. Supply organization, baggage regulations, the role of helot attendants, strict marching order, and the institutional routines that minimize disorder. Comparisons to other Greek polis highlight Sparta's unique integration of political authority, religious obligation, and military professionalism into a single structure. Overall, the section demonstrates how each element of the hierarchy, from kings to the smallest enomotia, contributed to a stable, adaptable, and tightly controlled military machine. Sparta's military hierarchy ensured both stability and control. With its army perfected, Sparta entered one of its defining conflicts. This section traces the origins of Spartan involvement in the Persian Wars by situating the polis within the broader geopolitical disruptions of the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE. It begins with the Ionian Revolt, 499 to 494 BCE, explaining how the rebellion of the Greek cities of Asia Minor against Persian rule set the stage for mainland Greek engagement. Although Sparta was approached by envoys from Miletus seeking military aid, the Spartans declined, an early indication of how carefully they assessed commitments beyond the Peloponnese, especially when campaigns risked prolonged absence from home and increased chances of helot revolt. The narrative then examines early diplomacy between Sparta and Persia, including the famous episode in which King Cleomenes rejected the Persian envoy's demand for earth and water. It also outlines growing tensions between Persia and Athens, whose request for Spartan assistance in 490 BCE, during Darius I's first invasion of the Greek mainland, exposed a divergence in strategic priorities. Sparta sent help too late to participate in the Battle of Marathon, largely due to religious constraints associated with the Carnea festival, which forbade military departures until the full moon. Attention is given to King Cleomenes I, a central figure whose actions shaped Spartan foreign policy in the years leading up to Xerxes' invasion. His campaigns in Aegina, his interventions in Athenian politics, and his sometimes erratic behavior, as depicted by Herodotus, reveal the internal pressures and divided viewpoints within Spartan leadership. The section emphasizes how Sparta attempted to balance its role as hegemon of the Peloponnese, its fear of internal instability, and the growing threat posed by the Persian Empire. By 481 BCE, shifting alliances and diplomatic efforts, including negotiations at the Corinthian Congress, pushed Sparta toward a leadership role in the collective Greek resistance. Yet even at this stage, Spartan engagement was marked by caution and pragmatism. Any commitment to continental defense required assurances that the Peloponnese would remain secure. Sparta approached the Persian threat cautiously, balancing internal and external demands. This caution met reality at Thermopylae. At Thermopylae, Spartan discipline confronted overwhelming Persian force. The confrontation at Thermopylae in 480 BCE emerged from Persia's second major attempt to subdue mainland Greece. Xerxes I assembled a coalition army drawn from across the empire, while naval forces advanced along the Aegean coast. According to Herodotus, troop numbers reached into the hundreds of thousands, though modern estimates generally place the Persian land force at between 70,000 and 120,000, depending on logistical reconstructions. The Greek response was coordinated through the Hellenic League, with Sparta assuming overall command. The strategic goal was to delay the Persian advance in northern Greece long enough for the Greek states to organize deeper defensive lines in central Greece and the Peloponnese. Thermopylae's significance rested largely on its geographical configuration. The pass consisted of a narrow coastal road at the base of Mount Kallidromos, bordered on the other side by the Malian Gulf. In antiquity, the road may have narrowed to as little as 15 meters in some places, based on geological studies and sediment analysis. This constriction neutralized the numerical advantage of the Persian army, making it one of the few locations where a smaller Greek force could plausibly hold the line. Archaeological surveys have identified defensive walls rebuilt by the Greek contingent under Leonidas, reinforcing Herodotus's description of fortifications that shaped the initial engagements. The Greek force at Thermopylae numbered somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 men, drawn from various polis including Thespae, Thebes, Phocis, and Corinth. Leonidas led approximately 300 Spartiates, selected from older age classes who already had heirs, an indication that the mission was considered highly risky. The presence of these 300 hoplites reflects a broader strategic calculation. While Sparta committed its elite troops, it avoided deploying the full citizen army during the Carnea festival and because of concerns about destabilizing the Peloponnese in the event of prolonged absence. The early stages of the battle illustrate the effectiveness of Greek hoplite tactics in narrow terrain. Herodotus describes the Spartans and their allies rotating men into the front line to maintain cohesion and minimize fatigue. Persian forces, including Medes and contingents from Central Asia, advanced in dense formations but struggled to break the Greek phalanx. This dynamic reveals a key analytical insight. Terrain could determine the relative value of military systems. In open fields, the Persian combination of archers, cavalry, and light infantry offered clear advantages. In narrow spaces, however, heavily armored hoplites were more effective, especially when commanded by leaders accustomed to strict discipline. Xerxes eventually deployed his immortals, the elite Persian infantry. Despite their reputation, they faced similar constraints in the pass and were unable to dislodge the Greeks. Herodotus's narrative may emphasize Greek resilience for dramatic effect, but even when interpreted cautiously, it is clear that the Greek defensive position held firm for 2 days. This delay served a strategic function. It bought crucial time for the Greek fleet stationed at Artemisium and for southern Greek states preparing additional fortifications. The turning point came when a local resident, Ephialtes of Trachis, guided the Persians along the Anapeia Path, a mountain trail that allowed them to outflank the Greek position. The existence of this path is well supported by topographical studies, which confirm a viable route for light infantry to maneuver behind the defenders. Leonidas received early warning of the encirclement from Phocian troops stationed on the trail, but the speed of the Persian movement limited Greek options. Leonidas dismissed the majority of the allied force and retained the Spartiates, Thespians, and a contingent of Thebans. The motivations for remaining varied. The Spartans were fulfilling their objective of holding the pass as long as possible. The Thespians refused to withdraw on principle, and the Thebans may have stayed reluctantly, according to Herodotus's account. This moment highlights an important interpretive point. The final stand was not exclusively Spartan, though Sparta's role became central in later commemoration. The last phase of the battle unfolded in close quarters. Sources describe repeated Persian assaults, including missile volleys and infantry charges, gradually overwhelming the defenders. Leonidas was killed in combat, and his body became the focus of a struggle between the two armies, an event that underscores the symbolic value of leadership in ancient warfare. Modern excavations near the Hill of Kolonos, traditionally identified as the site of the final stand, have uncovered spearheads, arrowheads, and other artifacts consistent with repeated engagements. Although the archaeological record does not precisely confirm Herodotus's descriptions, it supports the overall depiction of intense fighting in the area. Despite their defeat, the Greek defenders accomplished a form of strategic success. The delay at Thermopylae allowed the Greek fleet to disengage from Artemisium in an orderly manner, and the time gained contributed to the subsequent defense of central Greece. Thermopylae also demonstrated that disciplined infantry could resist Persian forces under specific conditions, an insight that influenced strategic planning leading into the battles of Salamis and Plataea. The battle entered Greek cultural memory almost immediately. The epitaph recorded by Herodotus, "Go tell the Spartans," reflects how later generations interpreted the event. Modern scholarship, however, emphasizes that Thermopylae should be understood less as an act of heroic sacrifice and more as a calculated effort to manage time and terrain in the face of overwhelming odds. The stand did not aim to stop the Persian advance permanently but to shape the conditions under which later engagements could be fought. By the time Thermopylae fell, Persian forces had a clear route into central Greece. The defeat of the land force compelled the Greek coalition to reconsider its defensive posture, particularly around the Isthmus of Corinth and the naval positions on the Saronic Gulf. The war continued beyond the pass. Sparta played a decisive role in concluding the Greco-Persian Wars. The Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE represented the final major land engagement of the Greco-Persian Wars and the definitive moment when the Greek coalition reversed the momentum of the invasion. Following the Persian defeat at Salamis, Xerxes withdrew the majority of his forces to Asia, leaving a substantial contingent under Mardonius to secure central Greece. The Persian strategy rested on diplomacy, fortified positions, and controlled mobility within Boeotia. Sources indicate that Mardonius attempted to persuade Athens into neutrality through promises of autonomy and reconstruction aid. When these offers failed, he sacked Athens a second time, prompting the Hellenic League to assemble a large land force under Spartan command. Sparta's decision to take the field was shaped by its position within the coalition and the recognition that a decisive engagement was necessary to prevent Persia from re-establishing control. The commanding general was Pausanias, the regent for Leonidas's son, as the boy was too young to rule. Pausanias's leadership reflects the dual function of Spartan kingship and regency. Although not a king himself, he exercised full military authority on behalf of the state. The coalition force included contingents from nearly all major Greek polis, including Athens, Corinth, Megara, Tegea, and Plataea. Herodotus provides a total of roughly 38,700 hoplites and tens of thousands of light troops, although modern assessments often reduce these estimates to more conservative figures based on logistical feasibility. The battlefield around Plataea offered open terrain, contrasting sharply with the confined pass of Thermopylae. This environment required a different tactical approach. Greek hoplites relied on tight formations and heavy armor, while Persian forces used a combination of missile troops, infantry with wicker shields, and cavalry. The presence of Persian cavalry posed a significant challenge, as mounted units could disrupt Greek supply lines and exploit gaps between contingents. Archaeological studies of the region's riverbeds and slopes help explain the movement patterns described by ancient authors. The Asopos River, flowing east-west, marked a key geographical reference point throughout the engagement. Early maneuvering reflected the complexity of coordinating a multipolis army. Pausanias maintained a defensive position on slightly elevated ground to avoid exposure to Persian cavalry. Mardonius attempted to undermine the Greek formation by launching cavalry raids, one of which succeeded in contaminating the Greek water supply by blocking access to the Gargaphia spring. This incident illustrates the role of logistical vulnerabilities in ancient warfare. Even a numerically strong army could be weakened by disrupted provisions. Pausanias responded by planning a controlled night withdrawal to more defensible terrain closer to Plataea. However, the maneuver did not unfold as intended. Different contingents moved at varying speed. When Mardonius recognized the disordered movement, he launched a rapid assault. The Spartans, Tegeans, and other Peloponnesians formed the core of the Greek right wing, while the Athenians opposed Persian-allied Greek forces on the left. Herodotus's description emphasizes that the Spartans bore the brunt of the Persian attack. The fighting centered on the Persian infantry, whose wicker shields and lighter equipment were less effective in close combat. Greek sources describe a prolonged clash during which the Persian line gradually gave way under the pressure of the hoplite advance. Pausanias reportedly invoked religious omens before ordering the full charge, though this detail likely reflects literary conventions rather than precise historical documentation. A crucial turning point occurred when Mardonius was struck, according to Herodotus, by a Spartan named Ares or Aramnestus. The death of the Persian commander caused a collapse in morale and led to the disintegration of Persian resistance. Archaeological investigations around Plataea have uncovered arrowheads and spear tips consistent with large-scale engagements, though no clear mass graves have been directly linked to the battle. These findings support the general depiction of intense combat and reinforce the broader conclusion that the Persian forces were decisively outmatched once the engagement shifted to close quarters. The Athenian contingent simultaneously defeated the Persian-aligned Greek forces on the left, preventing them from supporting the main Persian body. This two-front collapse marked the coalition's victory. The Greek pursuit continued across the plain, and according to ancient accounts, the Persian camp, fortified with wooden palisades, was stormed after heavy fighting. The fall of the camp is significant for understanding the battle's outcome. It demonstrates that the Greeks destroyed not only the field army but also the logistical base that sustained Persian operations in central Greece. Plataea's aftermath extended beyond the battlefield itself. The victory eliminated Persia's ability to reassert control over mainland Greece and ensured the survival of the independent polis. Pausanias oversaw the dedication of a victory offering at Delphi, inscribed with a collective claim of shared achievement by the Greek cities. However, later tradition attributed an overly boastful inscription to Pausanias personally, prompting Spartan authorities to distance themselves from it. This episode illustrates the tension between personal prestige and collective identity within Spartan leadership. In the broader strategic framework, Plataea marked the shift from defensive warfare to offensive operations against Persian interests in the Aegean. The Greek fleet soon won a parallel victory at Mycale, further weakening Persian positions. The combined effect of these battles ended the direct threat to Greece and allowed Athens to emerge as the leader of a new maritime coalition, the Delian League. This development would reshape Greek politics, generating the conditions for future rivalry between Athens and Sparta. The significance of Plataea lies not only in its military outcome but also in its political consequences. Sparta's leadership at the battle reinforced its role as the principal defender of mainland Greece. Yet the aftermath also exposed divergences in strategic priorities. While Athens sought continued operations against Persia, Sparta turned its attention back to the Peloponnese. This divergence foreshadowed the competing visions that would define the next century of Greek interstate relations. Victory shifted Greek power. Sparta had emerged as the preeminent land power, having led the Hellenic League to victory at Plataea, while Athens' naval contributions, particularly at Salamis and Mycale, had established the polis as a dominant maritime force. The immediate post-war period was characterized by cooperation, but structural and ideological differences between the two leading polis soon produced friction. The foundation of the Delian League in 478 BCE under Athenian leadership exemplified the divergence. It was ostensibly formed to continue operations against Persia and protect the Aegean, yet its membership system, tribute collection, and centralized naval command increasingly reflected Athens' strategic and economic priorities rather than collective decision-making. In contrast, Sparta maintained the Peloponnesian League, a land-based coalition focused on oligarchic stability and internal security, particularly the containment of Helot populations. Tensions were amplified by contrasting approaches to Persian diplomacy and fortification. Sparta, mindful of its experience in Thermopylae and Plataea, favored a conservative, defensive posture. Athens, with its naval supremacy, pursued an offensive, outward-looking strategy that included rebuilding its city walls and fortifying Piraeus. These measures, intended to secure the polis against potential Persian retaliation, alarmed Sparta, which interpreted Athenian fortifications as a challenge to Peloponnesian authority and a potential threat to the balance of power. Archaeological evidence from the 5th century BCE fortification walls of Athens supports the scale and rapid construction of these defensive measures, indicating the urgency with which the Athenians pursued security and strategic advantage. The Helot revolt of 465 to 464 BCE, triggered by a major earthquake in Laconia, became a decisive episode in Sparta-Athens relations. The disaster destabilized Spartan control over Messenia and forced the dispatch of a contingent of hoplites to suppress the uprising. Athens, under the generalship of Cimon, sent support to Sparta, providing approximately 4,000 hoplites, a significant contribution. However, Sparta's unexpected rejection of Athenian assistance shocked the Athenians and publicly highlighted the growing mistrust between the two allies. Historians interpret this incident as a major turning point. It exposed Sparta's insistence on controlling its domestic affairs independently and signaled to Athens that its wartime cooperation would not translate into political parity within the Greek alliance system. Other factors contributing to the emerging rivalry included disputes over alliance leadership and command prerogatives. Athens increasingly exerted influence over the naval campaigns of the Delian League, leveraging tribute to maintain ships and fund expeditions. Sparta, conversely, retained its preeminence in coordinating land forces but was reluctant to participate in maritime operations outside the Peloponnese. These structural differences created a feedback loop of mutual suspicion. Sparta viewed Athens' naval dominance and tribute collection as hegemonic and potentially destabilizing, while Athens perceived Spartan conservatism and reluctance to support collective Hellenic defense as limiting its strategic autonomy. Further exacerbating tensions were ideological contrasts. Sparta emphasized stability, internal cohesion, and the maintenance of the oligarchic order, especially in allied states. Athens promoted civic participation and, increasingly, imperial consolidation through tribute and political influence over member polis. The Delian League's institutional framework, centralized treasury management, appointment of Athenian generals, and enforcement of allied compliance, gradually transformed a defensive coalition into a quasi-imperial structure. While Sparta initially tolerated this evolution, its suspicion of Athens' growing influence set the stage for enduring conflict. The post-Persian environment also witnessed localized flashpoints that reflected broader structural dynamics. Corinth and other Peloponnesian allies monitored Athenian expansion with concern, interpreting naval buildup, city fortifications, and intervention in regional disputes as indicative of Athens' intent to assert dominance over both maritime and land interests. These incidents reinforced the perception in Sparta that Greek unity was fragile and contingent, and that proactive measures might be required to preserve Peloponnesian authority. In summary, the years following the Persian Wars reveal a complex interplay of structural, strategic, and ideological factors that transformed former allies into competitors. The divergence between Athens' outward-looking maritime ambitions and Sparta's inward-focused land-based conservatism, coupled with critical flashpoints such as the Helot revolt and Athenian fortifications, created persistent friction. Archaeological evidence, combined with Herodotus and Thucydides' accounts, demonstrates that these tensions were systemic rather than episodic. The rejection of Athenian forces during the Messenian crisis, in particular, symbolized the limits of wartime cooperation and the emergence of long-term rivalry. As mistrust deepened, conflict became harder to avoid, setting the stage for the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. When war finally broke out, Sparta relied on traditional land power, while Athens turned to its naval strength. The Archidamian War, the first phase of the broader Peloponnesian conflict, commenced in 431 BCE following escalating tensions between Athens and Sparta, fueled by disputes over alliance obligations, trade sanctions, and regional influence. The war is named after Archidamus II, the Spartan king who advocated a cautious but persistent campaign strategy against Athens. Archidamus recognized the necessity of sustained pressure on the Athenian hinterland, conducting annual invasions of Attica designed to destroy crops and compel Athens to engage on unfavorable terms. This traditional land-based strategy reflected Sparta's institutional strengths: a heavily trained hoplite force, control over Peloponnesian allies, and a reliance on rural devastation as a tool of coercion. Athens, in contrast, followed the strategic guidance of Pericles, who prioritized the city's naval supremacy. Pericles' doctrine emphasized avoiding direct confrontation on land with the superior Spartan army while employing the Athenian fleet to raid coastal territories, secure supply lines, and maintain communications with the Delian League. Athens also leveraged its walls and fortifications, creating a fortified urban center capable of withstanding repeated land assaults. The combination of naval mobility and fortified defensive positions allowed Athens to survive repeated Spartan incursions while projecting influence throughout the Aegean. The first year of the war highlighted the contrasting approaches. Archidamus led a traditional invasion, devastating farmland and attempting to provoke a pitched battle. The Athenians, however, adhered to Pericles' strategy, remaining within the long walls and avoiding direct engagement. Contemporary sources, primarily Thucydides, emphasize the psychological and material strain imposed on both sides. Spartan forces faced logistical challenges sustaining campaigns away from home territory, while Athenians experienced population density pressures and reliance on imported grain. Archaeological evidence, including charred agricultural sites and abandoned rural settlements, corroborates the widespread destruction described in textual accounts. During the second year of conflict, Athens faced a severe internal crisis. The plague of 430 to 426 BCE, likely typhoid or a similar epidemic, devastated the densely populated urban center. Thucydides provides a detailed eyewitness account, describing mortality rates that may have reached 1/4 of the population. The plague affected not only civilians but also the military and leadership. Pericles himself succumbed in 429 BCE. The epidemic had strategic consequences. It temporarily reduced Athens' operational capacity, slowed naval expeditions, and prompted reconsideration of Pericles' previously cautious policies. It also exacerbated social tensions, including disputes over tribute, rationing, and morale within the long walls. Sparta's inability to capitalize fully on Athenian weakness during the plague illustrates another key structural factor. Its reliance on hoplite-based campaigns required cooperation from allies and seasonal coordination, which often produced delays or inconsistent enforcement of the invasion strategy. Despite repeated annual incursions, the Spartans were unable to breach Athens' defenses or decisively force a pitched battle. Similarly, Athens' strategy of hit-and-run raids and maritime disruption prevented Spartan or Peloponnesian allies from consolidating control over strategic coastal regions. This balance of structural strengths and limitations produced a prolonged stalemate. Naval actions during the first decade further shaped the conflict. The Athenian fleet secured the Saronic Gulf and maintained supply lines to the city, enabling continued agricultural importation and trade, including the critical grain shipments from Euboea and the Black Sea. Athenian raids along Peloponnesian coasts disrupted Spartan economic resources and pressured allied cities. Archaeological surveys of coastal fortifications and sunken ship remains corroborate these accounts, suggesting widespread maritime activity consistent with Thucydides' descriptions of naval dominance and blockade enforcement. Political dynamics within Sparta and Athens also influenced the course of the war. In Sparta, the dual kingship and council of Ephyrs maintained a consensus-based approach, occasionally limiting aggressive initiatives when allied cooperation faltered. Athens, conversely, experienced fluctuating political leadership, especially following Pericles' death, which affected strategic cohesion and encouraged more aggressive expeditions and opportunistic campaigns. These internal governance structures illustrate how institutional design shaped operational decisions and contributed to the decade-long attrition that characterized the Peloponnesian War. An interpretive insight emerges when considering the 10-year stalemate. Neither side possessed the capacity for rapid, decisive resolution due to structural and geographic constraints. Sparta's dominance on land could not translate to effective maritime operations, while Athens' naval superiority could not decisively break Spartan control of the countryside. The interplay of geography, military doctrine, and political institutions produced a war of attrition that strained resources, populations, and alliances without immediate resolution. By 421 BCE, the war reached a temporary pause with the negotiation of the Peace of Nicias, intended as a 50-year truce. While the peace reflected exhaustion and recognition of mutual limitations, it also demonstrated the fragility of settlements imposed by strategic stalemate. Both Athens and Sparta remained militarily capable and politically motivated, leaving underlying tensions unresolved. Historians often view this period as a demonstration of how structural differences, naval versus land power, institutional flexibility versus oligarchic caution, shaped conflict duration and outcomes. After 10 years of attrition, events outside mainland Greece shifted the balance, setting the stage for renewed hostilities in the Sicilian and Ionian theaters. The disaster in Sicily marked a turning point that Spartans exploited with growing confidence. In 415 BCE, Athens embarked on a major overseas campaign that would have far-reaching consequences. The Sicilian expedition, ostensibly aimed at reinforcing allied Greek cities against Syracuse and consolidating Athenian influence in the western Mediterranean. The expedition ultimately reflected Athens' naval ambition and perceived strategic invulnerability. The operation mobilized approximately 27,000 men, including hoplites, archers, cavalry, and a fleet of over 130 triremes. Historical sources, primarily Thucydides, emphasize both the scale of the commitment and the risk inherent in extending Athens' military beyond the Aegean. Archaeological evidence from Syracuse, including fortification layers and battlefield debris, corroborates the intensity and duration of the conflict. Sparta's response to Athenian overreach was decisive. Recognizing the strategic opportunity, Sparta supplied financial and logistical support to Syracuse and dispatched the experienced General Gylippus to organize resistance. Gylippus' leadership exemplifies Spartan adaptability. Although Sparta traditionally emphasized land campaigns in the Peloponnese, it now projected influence overseas by coordinating with allied cities. His arrival stabilized Syracuse's defenses, improved troop training, and integrated Sicilian contingents with Spartan tactical doctrine. This intervention illustrates a broader insight. Sparta could extend its influence indirectly through diplomacy, strategic patronage, and targeted command, compensating for limitations in naval experience. The Athenian operation quickly encountered operational difficulties. Logistical strains, extended supply lines, and miscalculations regarding local support created vulnerabilities. Thucydides records that disease, inadequate intelligence, and the overconfidence of Athenian generals, Nicias, Alcibiades, and Lamachus, exacerbated these challenges. The eventual defeat at Syracuse 413 BCE resulted in catastrophic losses. The destruction or capture of nearly the entire fleet, tens of thousands of men killed or enslaved, and the collapse of Athens' strategic position in the western Mediterranean. Archaeological surveys of Syracusan harbor sites have revealed remnants consistent with the remains of triremes and encampments described in classical accounts, confirming the magnitude of the Athenian loss. The consequences of the Sicilian disaster extended directly to the Peloponnesian theater. With Athens' manpower and morale severely depleted, Sparta seized the opportunity to initiate sustained operations in Attica. Under the guidance of the Ephybricidas and other military leaders, Sparta implemented year-round incursions, rather than the traditional seasonal campaigns, taking advantage of Athenian weakness. One significant measure was the fortification of Decelia in northern Attica, c. 413 BCE, establishing a permanent Spartan garrison within striking distance of Athens. This development disrupted the city's land-based supply routes, forced increased reliance on naval logistics, and imposed a psychological strain on Athenian populations, demonstrating the direct strategic link between the Sicilian defeat and Spartan operational advantages. The broader political implications also became evident. Athens' allies and subject cities perceived a shift in power dynamics, with several revolts and defections occurring in the aftermath. Thucydides notes that allies such as Chios and Lesbos defected to Sparta or pursued greater autonomy, reflecting both Athenian overextension and Sparta's growing credibility as a hegemon capable of projecting power across the Aegean. These events highlight a structural insight. Spartan influence was magnified not only by battlefield success, but also by the perception of reliability and strategic prudence in the management of allied relationships. The Sicilian expedition also altered internal Athenian politics. Following the failure, Athens faced intense political scrutiny, with the execution of generals held responsible for the defeat and the temporary decline of Periclean policies. This internal instability further weakened Athens' strategic capacity and allowed Sparta to exploit diplomatic and military openings in the Peloponnesian sphere. Meanwhile, Sparta, having demonstrated the ability to support distant allies effectively, gained confidence in directing coalition efforts beyond its traditional land-focused campaigns. From a military perspective, the Sicilian failure allowed Sparta to adapt its strategic posture. With Athens' naval preeminence temporarily curtailed, Sparta could pursue combined land and naval operations without facing the logistical constraints that had previously limited their campaigns. This included strengthening alliances in the Ionian coast, supporting rebellious cities, and maintaining pressure on Athens' surrounding territories. Archaeological studies in northern Attica and coastal fortifications indicate the scale and permanence of Spartan occupation during this period, confirming Thucydides' accounts of a protracted presence at Decelia. The section concludes with the insight that the Sicilian expedition's outcome exemplifies the interplay between strategic overreach, coalition warfare, and opportunity exploitation. Sparta's ability to capitalize on Athens' failure demonstrates the importance of structural and operational flexibility. By extending its influence indirectly through command of allies, the establishment of fortifications, and coordinated land campaigns, Sparta transformed a distant theater of operations into tangible advantages in the heart of the Peloponnese. With Athens weakened, the conflict moved toward its final, decisive phase, setting the stage for the closing campaigns of the Peloponnesian War. Persian gold allowed Sparta to fight a new kind of war, one Athens had once dominated. The final phase of the Peloponnesian War, often referred to as the Ionian War, 412 to 404 BCE, represented a decisive shift in both geography and strategy. Following Athens' protracted overextension and the failure of the Sicilian expedition, Sparta sought to challenge Athenian dominance beyond the Peloponnesus. Critical to this transition was the entrance of Persia as a financial backer. Persian satraps, particularly Tissaphernes and Cyrus the Younger, provided substantial subsidies that enabled Sparta to construct and maintain a fleet, a domain previously dominated by Athens. This strategic realignment transformed the conflict into a maritime contest, extending the theater of war into Ionia, the Cyclades, and the Hellespont, and allowing Sparta to operate effectively across the Aegean. The decision to expand Spartan naval capability required substantial internal debate. Traditional Spartan military doctrine emphasized hoplite superiority and land-based campaigns, reflecting the constraints and values of the Peloponnesian system. Nonetheless, the strategic opportunity presented by Persian funding and the vulnerabilities of Athens' stretched naval and allied networks prompted Sparta's governing bodies, including the Gerousia and Ephyrs, to approve the creation of a permanent fleet. The recruitment and training of crews, alongside the appointment of capable commanders such as Lysander, represented a significant institutional adaptation. Lysander's political acumen, including his cultivated relationships with Persian officials, facilitated both funding and intelligence support, illustrating how diplomacy and finance could be as decisive as battlefield tactics in late-stage Greek warfare. The Ionian War was characterized by a series of campaigns along the Aegean coast, where both Athens and Sparta sought to secure strategic harbors, suppress revolts, and control trade routes. Spartan forces, reinforced by their newly constructed fleet, operated in coordination with land contingents to support allied cities and undermine Athenian garrisons. Thucydides and Xenophon detail how Spartan naval operations in places such as Chios, Lesbos, and Samos exerted pressure on Athens' maritime network, gradually eroding its logistical and financial base. Archaeological surveys of Ionian harbors reveal fortification enhancements and evidence of naval activity, consistent with the presence of both Greek and Persian-sponsored fleets, confirming historical accounts of extended Spartan operations. Lysander's role proved decisive in consolidating these gains. He implemented a strategy of alliance building and client-state governance, strengthening local oligarchic factions aligned with Spartan interests. This approach allowed Sparta to maintain influence without deploying excessive manpower and created durable footholds in previously Athenian-controlled territories. A key example is the reorganization of oligarchic governments in Chios and Lesbos, which secured critical naval bases and disrupted Athenian tribute streams. This integration of military, political, and financial leverage demonstrates a systemic shift in Spartan operations. Land power alone was insufficient, and strategic coordination across multiple domains became essential. Throughout the Ionian campaigns, both sides experienced fluctuating fortunes. Athenian forces, although numerically diminished and increasingly reliant on mercenaries, retained pockets of resistance and temporarily recaptured some Ionian cities. These engagements reveal that naval dominance was neither immediate nor uncontested. Nonetheless, the infusion of Persian resources allowed Sparta to sustain longer-term operations, maintain fleet readiness, and incentivize allied cooperation. Modern interpretations of the period emphasize that the combination of external financing, local political alliances, and competent leadership enabled Sparta to overcome structural disadvantages in naval warfare. By 405 BCE, this strategic adaptation culminated in the Battle of Aegospotami, where Lysander's fleet decisively destroyed the Athenian navy. The engagement exemplified the cumulative effects of the Ionian War. Financial support, diplomatic leverage, and naval innovation had transformed Sparta into a force capable of challenging and ultimately surpassing Athens in maritime operations. The destruction of the fleet severed Athens' access to grain routes from the Black Sea and precipitated the city's eventual surrender in 404 BCE. Archaeological evidence, including shipwrecks and harbor remains along the Hellespont, corroborates accounts of large-scale naval engagement and the strategic control of key maritime corridors. The Ionian War illustrates several interpretive insights regarding late-stage Greek interstate conflict. First, it underscores the integration of economic and political factors into military outcomes. Persian subsidies and diplomatic alignment were as critical as Spartan hoplites or triremes. Second, it demonstrates institutional flexibility. Sparta, traditionally a land power, successfully adapted its command structures and military doctrine to exploit emerging opportunities. Finally, it highlights the systemic interdependence of Greek warfare. Naval and land operations, internal governance, and regional alliances interacted in a complex matrix that determined the outcome of the war. In conclusion, the Ionian War enabled Sparta to achieve a decisive transformation in strategy, leading directly to Athens' defeat and the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War. The combination of Persian financial support, strategic alliance building, and innovative command under Lysander allowed Sparta to project power across the Aegean, compensating for its traditional limitations in naval warfare. By 404 BCE, Sparta had established dominance on both land and sea, marking the culmination of a century-long ascent from regional hegemon to empire-scale influence. With these resources secured, Sparta positioned itself for a decisive strike against Athens, concluding the long chronological and interpretive arc of Spartan civilization. At Aegospotami, a single catastrophic defeat ended decades of Athenian maritime supremacy. The Battle of Aegospotami, fought in 405 BCE near the Hellespont, represents the decisive conclusion of the Peloponnesian War's naval phase. Following nearly a decade of attrition in the Ionian theater, Spartan strategy, under the command of Lysander, capitalized on sustained financial and logistical support from Persia. By this point, Athens' fleet had been depleted and morale weakened by years of continuous campaigning, overextension, and internal political strife. Thucydides and Xenophon described the Athenian forces, numbering approximately 180 triremes, as dispersed along the coastline, reliant on resupply and harboring limited intelligence on Spartan movements. Archaeological studies of the Hellespont region corroborate patterns of anchorage and provisioning consistent with the textual record. Lysander employed a combination of patience, reconnaissance, and strategic positioning. His fleet occupied the dominant coastal positions near Lampsacus, maintaining strict discipline while observing the Athenian deployment. Unlike prior engagements, Lysander avoided premature engagement, waiting for a moment when Athenian command routines exposed vulnerabilities. Thucydides emphasizes the Spartans' understanding of Athenian naval habits. The Athenians routinely sailed to forage for supplies during the day, leaving their ships moored and crews ashore, a predictable operational pattern that would prove critical. On the day of the engagement, the Athenian fleet remained onshore for provisions, and Lysander launched a coordinated assault on the unmanned triremes. Spartan forces captured 170 ships almost without resistance, leaving only a few vessels to flee. This decisive action effectively eliminated Athens' capacity to project naval power, severed control over key grain supply lines from the Hellespont, and isolated Athens from its remaining allies. The strategic implications of this single action cannot be overstated. Athens, once dominant across the Aegean, was suddenly incapable of sustaining maritime operations, trade, or the reinforcement of distant garrisons. The blockade of Piraeus followed immediately. Spartan forces, reinforced by allied contingents and local oligarchic factions, established permanent control over the harbor and surrounding territory. Athens' dependence on imported grain and naval mobility meant that the blockade produced acute logistical and humanitarian pressures. Contemporary sources describe shortages of food, restrictions on movement, and increased social tensions within the walled city. These constraints forced the city's leadership to negotiate surrender, highlighting how operational control of infrastructure and supply lines could determine outcomes, even without extensive direct combat. Athens' surrender in 404 BCE marked the formal end of the Peloponnesian War. Spartan terms were designed to dismantle Athens' capacity for future military dominance while maintaining a functioning city-state under oligarchic supervision. The long walls connecting Athens to Piraeus were partially demolished, and the Delian League was effectively dissolved. Spartan-appointed governors oversaw the establishment of a pro-Spartan oligarchy, the so-called 30 Tyrants, which replaced the democratic institutions that had governed Athens for nearly half a century. This reorganization emphasized Spartan hegemony and control over former adversaries, although it relied heavily on local compliance and allied enforcement. A critical interpretive insight emerges when examining the role of strategic and logistical planning in the agoge operation. Unlike earlier battles, success did not hinge on individual heroism or dramatic engagement. It derived from careful observation, anticipation of enemy routines, and coordinated execution. This demonstrates the increasing professionalization and systemic sophistication of Spartan military command by the late 5th century BCE. The integration of intelligence, fleet positioning, and timing exemplifies the maturation of Sparta's capacity to operate beyond its traditional land-based strengths. The consequences of the battle were profound but also structurally temporary. While Sparta emerged as the dominant Greek power, it faced long-term challenges in sustaining control over former Athenian allies, maritime territories, and economic networks. Unlike Athens, whose dominance had been reinforced by a naval economy and league tribute, Sparta lacked both institutional maritime experience and economic infrastructure to govern extensive overseas territories. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from the Hellespont and Aegean islands indicates sporadic revolts and shifting allegiances in the immediate post-war period, underscoring the limits of Spartan authority. Agoge also illustrates a broader systemic lesson regarding Greek interstate warfare. Decisive outcomes often depended on the interplay of logistics, intelligence, and resource management, rather than battlefield heroics alone. Sparta's reliance on Persian subsidies, coupled with adaptive command under Lysander, enabled it to exploit the strategic and operational weaknesses of Athens. Conversely, Athens' failure to maintain secure supply lines and disciplined operational routines rendered it vulnerable despite its historical naval dominance. In conclusion, the destruction of the Athenian fleet at Agoge and the subsequent blockade of Piraeus demonstrate the culmination of Sparta's long-term strategic adaptation. From a land-based hegemon to a maritime-capable power, Sparta leveraged external financing, political alliances, and disciplined operational planning to achieve supremacy. However, the limitations inherent in sustaining such dominance foreshadowed future instability, revealing that Spartan hegemony, while decisive, was inherently constrained by institutional, economic, and geographic factors. With Athens defeated, Sparta assumed a new, and ultimately unsustainable hegemony, concluding the military and political arc of its classical ascendancy. Sparta emerged victorious but soon discovered that empire came with challenges its system was not designed to manage. Following the surrender of Athens in 404 BCE, Sparta assumed a position of unparalleled dominance within the Greek world. To consolidate control, it implemented a series of administrative and political measures aimed at enforcing compliance and projecting authority. Key among these were the installation of harmasts, Spartan military governors assigned to oversee strategic cities and garrisons, and the establishment of the 30 tyrants in Athens, an oligarchic regime tasked with enforcing pro-Spartan policies and extracting tribute. These measures reflected Sparta's preference for direct control through military presence and loyalist administrations, rather than integrating conquered states into a federated or representative system. Economically, Sparta attempted to benefit from the tribute and resources of its newly dominated territories. While the dismantling of the Athenian Empire ended tribute collection through the Delian League, Sparta sought to maintain payments from key allies and subject cities. However, unlike Athens, Sparta lacked bureaucratic infrastructure and experience in administering widespread tribute networks. The reliance on local oligarchs, often of limited capacity or commitment, exposed the system to corruption, inefficiency, and resistance, reducing the effectiveness of Spartan financial extraction and undermining its ability to sustain long-term dominance. Politically, Sparta's approach revealed structural constraints. The Spartan constitution, designed for internal oligarchic stability and land-based military organization, was poorly suited to the administration of an extensive maritime empire. Harmasts and allied oligarchies were dependent on local cooperation, yet the Spartan state lacked the institutional flexibility and naval administration necessary to enforce consistent compliance across distant territories. This mismatch produced tensions between the desire for control and the limitations of logistical and political capacity, particularly in regions such as the Ionian coast and the Aegean Islands, where loyalties were divided and opportunities for revolt persisted. Resistance emerged rapidly. Cities that had been integrated into Athens' sphere of influence, including Thebes and several Ionian allies, began to reconsider their allegiance under Spartan oversight. The oligarchic regimes imposed by Sparta often faced internal opposition, undermining both legitimacy and stability. Even within the Peloponnesus, the need to maintain garrisons and manage tribute strained Spartan manpower and resources. These challenges illustrate a broader structural insight. Sparta's success in achieving hegemony relied on military force, but its political institutions were not designed to sustain a complex empire. Strategically, Sparta's dominance encouraged the formation of new coalitions opposed to its rule. Former allies of Athens, and even some neutral states, observed Sparta's limitations and began coordinating to resist its influence. The reliance on oligarchic regimes and punitive military oversight generated resentment, fostering conditions for renewed conflict within a few decades. The eventual resurgence of Thebes and the reassertion of Athenian influence in later conflicts can be traced to the structural weaknesses of Spartan governance identified during this period. In conclusion, the period following Athens' defeat demonstrates the inherent limits of Spartan hegemony. While Sparta achieved unparalleled military success and established temporary control over the Greek world, its system was poorly adapted for administering distant territories, maintaining tribute networks, or managing politically diverse populations. The reliance on local oligarchs, the absence of a bureaucratic administrative apparatus, and dependence on garrisons revealed the structural weaknesses of Spartan imperial power. These limitations ensured that, although Sparta emerged as the dominant military power, its dominance was inherently short-lived and fragile, foreshadowing the eventual rise of competing coalitions and the rebalancing of Greek power. These weaknesses became evident as new coalitions formed against Spartan rule, concluding the military and political arc of classical Sparta and setting the stage for the Hellenistic transformations that would follow. In the generation after victory, Sparta faced a coalition determined to curtail its influence. The Corinthian War, 395 to 387 BCE, marked the first significant challenge to Spartan hegemony following the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War. An alliance composed of Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, supported by Persian subsidies, coalesced to limit Sparta's post-war dominance. The conflict illustrates how external diplomacy and shifting balances of power could directly impact Greek interstate warfare. Persia, under King Artaxerxes II, sought to restrain Spartan control over Asia Minor and the Aegean, providing financial support for naval and land operations that enabled Athens and its allies to mount sustained opposition. This intervention underscores a systemic insight. Greek interstate conflict in the classical period was deeply influenced by the strategic priorities of powerful non-Greek actors. Early campaigns highlighted both Spartan strengths and vulnerabilities. On land, Sparta maintained superiority with its professional hoplite corps and disciplined army, conducting operations across central Greece and securing victories in engagements such as Nemea, 394 BCE. Naval operations, however, exposed limitations. The Spartan fleet, while competent under experienced commanders, struggled to achieve lasting dominance against combined Athenian and allied naval forces. The Battle of Cnidus, 394 BCE, demonstrated the crucial role of Persian funding in enabling coordinated opposition and highlighted the emerging importance of fleet coordination and maritime logistics in maintaining influence across the Aegean. Archaeological evidence of harbors and naval installations in this period corroborates historical accounts of extended naval campaigns and operational bases. Diplomatic dynamics further complicated the conflict. Persia's involvement shifted as strategic circumstances evolved, reflecting the empire's interest in balancing Greek powers rather than fully backing any single state. Persian subsidies oscillated in response to local developments, influencing the operational capacity of both Spartan and anti-Spartan forces. Thucydides' later commentators and Xenophon note that these fluctuations directly affected the outcome of campaigns, particularly regarding Athens' capacity to sustain naval operations and Sparta's ability to finance extended deployments. Despite initial setbacks, Sparta retained land superiority, allowing it to exert pressure on central Greek cities and secure its traditional Peloponnesian alliances. However, sustained opposition and the mobilization of allied resources demonstrated the structural limits of Spartan hegemony. The reliance on hoplite-based land power, while decisive in pitched battles, proved insufficient for consolidating influence over distant or maritime-oriented regions. Additionally, the logistical strain of extended campaigns exposed Spartan vulnerabilities in supply lines and coordination across multiple theaters of war. The war concluded with the King's Peace, Peace of Antalcidas, 387 BCE, brokered by Persia. The treaty temporarily preserved Spartan authority over central and southern Greece, while formalizing Persian control over Asia Minor. The agreement illustrates a key structural lesson. Spartan dominance, even when militarily secure, remained contingent on external diplomatic recognition and alignment with non-Greek powers. The King's Peace reinforced Sparta's authority over its immediate allies but simultaneously exposed the fragility of its wider hegemony, highlighting the tension between military success and sustainable political control. From an interpretive perspective, the Corinthian War demonstrates the interplay between military capability, alliance formation, and external diplomacy. Sparta's capacity to project land-based power remained significant, yet naval weakness, reliance on garrison allies, and vulnerability to financial manipulation by Persia limited its long-term dominance. The conflict also illustrates the systemic challenges faced by a state whose institutions were optimized for oligarchic land warfare, but were less adaptable to coalition management, maritime coordination, and prolonged interstate negotiation. In conclusion, the Corinthian War underscores that Sparta's post-Peloponnesian War supremacy was neither absolute nor enduring. While victories in pitched battles preserved its immediate territorial control, the combination of allied opposition, Persian intervention, and structural limitations foreshadowed the gradual erosion of Spartan dominance. The king's peace provided temporary stabilization, yet it also codified the limits of Spartan authority, establishing conditions that would allow subsequent states, including Thebes and eventually Macedon, to exploit systemic weaknesses in the Spartan model. Although Sparta emerged temporarily strengthened, new challenges soon proved fatal to its dominance, ushering in a period of political and military decline. At Leuctra, Thebes shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE represents a pivotal turning point in classical Greek military history and the decline of Spartan dominance. Facing the Theban general Epaminondas, Sparta deployed a traditional hoplite phalanx, relying on the discipline and cohesion that had underpinned its centuries-long military reputation. However, Thebes employed innovative tactical methods, most notably the oblique formation, which concentrated forces on the Spartan right flank while maintaining a thinner line elsewhere. Ancient sources, including Xenophon and later Plutarch, emphasize how this deployment targeted the elite Spartan hastati and king's regiments, achieving local superiority despite being outnumbered in the overall field. A critical factor in the battle's outcome was the role of the Sacred Band of Thebes, a professional, tightly trained unit composed of 150 paired men whose cohesion and morale were instrumental in breaking the Spartan frontline. Archaeological studies of funerary monuments and inscriptions at Leuctra corroborate the presence of a large-scale engagement and support historical accounts of unusually high Spartan casualties. Estimates suggest that Sparta lost approximately 400 elite soldiers, including a significant proportion of its king's guard, alongside hundreds of additional hoplites. This loss was disproportionate given the small size of the Spartan citizen body, highlighting the demographic vulnerability inherent in Sparta's rigid social and military system. The tactical innovations at Leuctra exemplify the evolution of Greek warfare. By concentrating force at a decisive point, Epaminondas demonstrated how maneuver, depth, and local superiority could overcome traditional reliance on uniform phalanx strength. Sparta's failure to adapt quickly to such changes underscores a systemic weakness. Its military institutions, optimized for internal cohesion and incremental tactical innovation, were ill-prepared for opponents who could combine flexibility, psychological cohesion, and unconventional deployment. The defeat forced Sparta to reconsider both its operational doctrines and its broader strategic posture in the Peloponnesus. The consequences of the battle extended beyond immediate military losses. Spartan confidence, previously grounded in centuries of battlefield success, was severely undermined, affecting the morale of allied contingents and the stability of Spartan garrisons across the Peloponnesus. Additionally, the demographic impact was profound. With the small number of full Spartiates reduced further by casualties, the state faced long-term challenges in maintaining a viable hoplite corps, weakening both offensive capacity and the ability to enforce control over the Helot population. This demographic vulnerability was a structural limitation embedded within Sparta's rigid social system, which had historically prioritized a small, elite warrior class over broader population integration. Politically, the defeat at Leuctra emboldened rivals and former allies. Thebes emerged as a dominant land power, initiating campaigns to liberate Messenia and secure autonomy for formerly subjugated populations. Athens, Corinth, and other states, observing the erosion of Spartan invincibility, recalibrated alliances and diplomatic strategies, exploiting Spartan weaknesses in both manpower and administrative reach. Archaeological evidence, including the fortification enhancements in Thebes and recovered battlefield artifacts, supports textual accounts of a rapid shift in regional power structures following 371 BCE. Leuctra thus illustrates several interpretive insights relevant to the decline of Sparta. First, It demonstrates the interaction between tactical innovation and systemic vulnerability. Even a historically dominant military can be overturned when social and institutional rigidity limits adaptability. Second, it highlights the demographic fragility of a society dependent on a fixed warrior class. Finally, the battle underscores the strategic consequences of loss. Military defeat directly influenced political authority, regional influence, and the capacity to maintain hegemony. In conclusion, the Battle of Leuctra decisively ended Spartan military supremacy, revealing that the state's social, demographic, and institutional structures could no longer sustain dominance over the increasingly dynamic Greek world. While Sparta retained political influence and some territorial control, its inability to replenish elite manpower, adapt tactics fully, and project power effectively marked the onset of permanent decline. The defeat illustrates how military innovation, allied coordination, and demographic factors collectively determined the trajectory of classical Greek states. The consequences extended beyond a single battle, setting the stage for Spartan decline and the gradual emergence of new powers within Greece. The loss of Messenia deprived Sparta of the labor base that had sustained its power for centuries. Following the catastrophic defeat at Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta confronted the rapid unraveling of its territorial and socio-economic foundations. The liberation of Messenia, led by Epaminondas and Theban forces, resulted in the establishment of the independent city of Messene on fortified terrain designed to resist Spartan reconquest. This event removed the Helot population from Spartan control, eliminating the forced labor force that had underpinned both agricultural productivity and the provisioning of the Spartan hoplite class. Archaeological surveys of Messene reveal systematic urban planning, fortifications, and settlement patterns consistent with strategic independence from Sparta, confirming historical accounts of its deliberate design to limit Spartan influence. The demographic consequences for Sparta were acute. With the loss of Messenian helots and ongoing attrition among the Spartiates due to prior battles, the citizen warrior class contracted further. Estimates suggest a decline to only a few hundred full citizens capable of fulfilling the rigorous obligations of military service. This contraction not only weakened Sparta's offensive capabilities but also compromised its internal governance, as the dual kingship, Gerousia, and Ephrate relied upon a stable and numerous citizen base to maintain authority. The narrow demographic pool exacerbated vulnerability to external pressures and internal unrest. Economically, the absence of Messenian labor disrupted agricultural production in the Eurotas Valley and surrounding territories. The reduction in surplus undermined both trade and provisioning of military forces, compelling Sparta to rely more heavily on limited remaining helots and allied contributions. These constraints highlight the interdependence of Spartan social hierarchy, economy, and military readiness. The helot system had been essential for sustaining a small warrior elite, and its removal revealed the fragility of this structure. Politically, the loss of Messenia catalyzed social tensions. Remaining Spartiates faced increasing burdens to maintain defense and authority, while helots in other regions observed the precedent of emancipation, encouraging unrest and rebellion. The combination of demographic contraction, economic shortfall, and potential insurrection created a systemic crisis. Sparta's inability to integrate new populations or compensate for lost labor exposed fundamental limitations in its rigid, militarized societal model. In conclusion, the liberation of Messenia and the resulting internal crisis marked the final phase of classical Spartan decline. The state, once sustained by a vast helot population and a disciplined hoplite elite, faced demographic, economic, and social pressures it could not reconcile. This period underscores the critical role of structural factors, population base, labor systems, and institutional rigidity in determining the longevity of a state. Sparta, though still politically present, had lost the foundations of its former power, entering the Hellenistic era diminished and constrained. With its foundations weakened, Sparta entered the Hellenistic age diminished, completing the trajectory from regional hegemon to a state constrained by demographic and economic realities. In the Hellenistic era, Spartan leaders attempted to restore a system built for an earlier age. During the 3rd century BCE, Sparta confronted profound political, social, and military challenges that threatened its continued relevance in a rapidly changing Greek world. The once dominant polis faced a shrinking citizen population, economic contraction, and diminished military capacity. In response, several Spartan kings initiated reform efforts aimed at restoring the agoge, reinforcing military discipline, and redistributing land to expand the base of full citizens capable of serving as hoplites. Among the most prominent were Agis IV r. 245 to 241 BCE and Cleomenes III r. 235 to 222 BCE, who attempted to revive the social and military systems that had defined Sparta during its classical zenith. Ancient sources, including Plutarch's accounts, document these reform efforts, though historians emphasize the difficulty of disentangling fact from idealized narratives of heroism. Agis IV's program focused on economic redistribution and citizenship expansion. He sought to address the extreme concentration of land and wealth among a small oligarchic elite, which had limited the number of active Spartiates and undermined both military and political functionality. Plutarch notes that Agis proposed canceling debts and reallocating land to restore a larger citizen body capable of sustaining the hoplite army. These reforms, however, faced resistance from the ephors and entrenched elites, who feared the erosion of their political influence. Agis's eventual assassination illustrates the structural rigidity of Spartan institutions and the difficulty of implementing reforms in a society built on oligarchic consensus and conservative landholding patterns. Cleomenes III continued the attempt at systemic restoration several decades later. His reforms were more comprehensive, encompassing full-scale land redistribution, reinstatement of the agoge for youth, and expansion of the citizen soldier class. He centralized authority, reducing epheral interference, and conducted military campaigns to secure regional dominance. His efforts temporarily strengthened Sparta, both politically and militarily, allowing him to challenge neighboring states and assert limited Hellenistic influence. Archaeological evidence, including fortification improvements and urban reorganization in Sparta during this period, supports historical accounts of renewed military focus and state centralization. Externally, Sparta faced significant challenges from Macedon and other Hellenistic powers, which limited the feasibility of sustained internal reform. The geopolitics of the era, characterized by the territorial ambitions of Antigonus III Docen, rendered Sparta vulnerable to invasion and coercion despite its internal efforts. The Battle of Sellasia in 222 BCE, where Cleomenes' forces were decisively defeated by Antigonus III, effectively ended Spartan attempts to restore classical dominance. Sources indicate that Spartan casualties were substantial, and the surviving polity became subordinate to Macedonian authority, highlighting the structural limitations of reviving archaic institutions within a transformed geopolitical context. These reform attempts illustrate several interpretive insights. First, they underscore the challenge of sustaining traditional institutions when demographic and economic foundations have eroded. The agoge and hoplite system were designed for a society with a robust citizen population and controlled labor force. By the Hellenistic era, both had declined sharply. Second, the resistance from internal elites demonstrates the incompatibility of radical reform with entrenched oligarchic structures, a recurring theme in Sparta's late history. Finally, the external pressures from Macedon and the broader Hellenistic world reveal the interdependence of domestic reforms and regional strategic realities. Internal revival alone was insufficient to secure lasting power. In conclusion, the 3rd century BCE reform efforts of Agis IV and Cleomenes III represent the last significant attempts to restore classical Spartan systems. While they temporarily reinvigorated military and civic structures, internal resistance and external geopolitical pressures ensured that these reforms could not reverse the long-term decline. Sparta's experience demonstrates the limits of institutional revival in a transformed socio-political environment, setting the stage for its reduced role in the Hellenistic and later Roman periods. With reform failures mounting, Sparta increasingly fell under external influence, marking a transition from autonomous polis to a state constrained by foreign powers. By the 2nd century BCE, Sparta's fate was increasingly determined by powers beyond Greece. In the 2nd century BCE, Sparta's political autonomy was increasingly constrained by the broader dynamics of Greek interstate politics and the rising influence of Rome. The city found itself enmeshed in conflicts with the Achaean League, a federated coalition of Peloponnesian states that sought to consolidate regional control. Spartan efforts to resist Achaean dominance included limited military campaigns and diplomatic appeals to traditional allies, but these measures were insufficient to preserve independence. Rome, emerging as the preeminent power in the eastern Mediterranean, increasingly mediated disputes, arbitrated territorial claims, and imposed terms that favored stability over Spartan sovereignty. During this period, Roman intervention was decisive. Sparta appealed to Rome against perceived overreach by the Achaean League, and Roman envoys enforced settlements that gradually curtailed Spartan authority. This process did not immediately eliminate the city's internal institutions, but it subordinated Spartan political agency to an external arbiter. Ancient sources, including Polybius, note that Spartan kings retained nominal influence, but the ephral system and citizen assemblies operated within the framework of Roman oversight. This arrangement demonstrates how external pressures could reshape traditional political structures without entirely dismantling them. Sparta's integration into the Roman provincial system was gradual. Following Rome's conquest of Greece in the mid-2nd century BCE, the city became part of the province of Achaea, subject to Roman administrative and fiscal structures. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions, civic buildings, and urban modifications, indicates both continuity and adaptation. Sparta maintained aspects of its local governance, religious cults, and public rituals, even as ultimate authority rested with Roman officials. The persistence of cultural and civic traditions highlights the distinction between political subordination and cultural extinction, emphasizing continuity alongside transformation. Economically, Sparta faced constraints as its formerly extensive networks of land control, helot labor, and regional influence had been significantly reduced. The Roman period imposed new taxation, limited military activity, and required accommodation within a provincial economy. These changes reoriented Spartan society away from independent military expansion toward a more localized civic focus. Archaeological surveys of Roman-period Sparta demonstrate modest urban development, renovations of civic spaces, and continued activity in sanctuaries such as Amyclae and the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, reflecting ongoing religious and cultural investment despite political subordination. From an interpretive perspective, this period illustrates the adaptive capacity of Spartan institutions. While Rome curtailed military and political autonomy, local traditions persisted. The dual kingship, ephors, and assemblies continued to operate symbolically, preserving a civic identity rooted in centuries of historical precedent. Sparta's experience underscores a broader structural insight. States can maintain cultural and institutional continuity even under the authority of a hegemonic power, provided that local practices remain socially salient and symbolically reinforced. In conclusion, Sparta's incorporation into the Roman sphere demonstrates the complex interplay of external domination and internal continuity. By the 2nd century BCE, the city's political authority had been subordinated to Rome and regional federations, yet its cultural, religious, and civic identity endured. This period reflects institutional transformation rather than outright collapse, highlighting how Sparta's legacy persisted within new structural realities and laid the groundwork for its continued influence in literature, historiography, and cultural memory throughout the Roman era. Though politically reduced, the idea of Sparta remained culturally influential, shaping perceptions of military discipline, civic order, and social organization well into the imperial period. As the ancient polis faded, Laconia adapted to new religious and political contexts. By the late antique period, Sparta's urban and political structures had undergone profound transformation. The once militarized city saw significant urban contraction, with much of the population dispersing to smaller settlements across the Eurotas Valley and surrounding highlands. Archaeological evidence indicates the abandonment of central civic buildings and fortifications, while continued habitation is visible through modest residential and ecclesiastical constructions. This contraction reflects a broader pattern in Greece during late antiquity, where demographic shifts, economic changes, and external pressures prompted reorganization of urban space. The Christianization of Laconia played a central role in redefining regional identity. Pagan cults and traditional Spartan religious practices declined, replaced by Christian institutions, churches, and monastic communities. Inscriptions, basilica foundations, and ecclesiastical records document the integration of Laconia into the wider network of Byzantine religious administration. This process not only transformed spiritual life but also reshaped local governance and social hierarchies, as ecclesiastical authorities often assumed roles formerly occupied by civic institutions. Despite these changes, a distinct regional identity persisted. References in Byzantine sources highlight the continued recognition of Sparta as a geographic and cultural marker, even as its political authority had vanished. Local customs, collective memory of military traditions, and continuity in settlement patterns preserved a sense of historical identity that bridged classical, Hellenistic, and medieval periods. This endurance illustrates the capacity of cultural memory to persist independent of political or military structures. In conclusion, by the early medieval period, Laconia had transitioned from the center of a powerful polis to a region defined by rural settlements and ecclesiastical organization, yet it retained a recognizable Spartan identity. These transformations mark the final phase of historical Sparta, completing the chronological narrative and setting the stage for its reception in historiography, literature, and cultural imagination. The story of Sparta now shifted from history to interpretation, where its legacy would influence both scholarship and cultural memory for centuries to come. Ancient authors shaped the earliest narratives about Sparta, each emphasizing different aspects of its system. Sparta's historical identity was first constructed through the writings of contemporary and near-contemporary Greek authors, whose works provide both descriptive and evaluative accounts of its institutions, society, and military practices. Herodotus, writing in the mid-5th century BCE, highlighted the collective discipline and resilience of the Spartan hoplite, emphasizing the city's role in the Persian Wars. He often juxtaposed Spartan stability with the perceived volatility of other Greek city-states, framing Sparta as a model of internal cohesion and martial excellence. Yet even Herodotus acknowledged contradictions. The rigid social hierarchy, dependence on the Helot population, and inflexibility in political processes could produce vulnerability under exceptional circumstances. Thucydides, in his account of the Peloponnesian War, similarly examined Spartan conduct with analytical precision. He emphasized strategic decision-making, the prioritization of land-based military power, and adherence to traditional norms, portraying Sparta as a state capable of both prudence and effective coercion. Thucydides' focus on cause-and-effect relationships, rather than moral judgment, provides insight into systemic strengths and weaknesses. Spartan successes in conventional engagements contrasted with limitations in prolonged conflict, naval operations, and adaptive tactics. Xenophon, himself a participant in Greek military and political affairs, provided a more idealized depiction of Spartan life in works such as the Polity of the Lacedaemonians. He praised the agoge, the integration of civic and military training, and the ethical framework underpinning the Spartan constitution. Xenophon's accounts emphasize stability, equality among citizens, and social cohesion, while minimizing the exploitative aspects of helotage. His perspective offers both descriptive information and normative interpretation, reflecting the admiration of certain contemporaries for Spartan order and discipline. In contrast, Aristotle provides a more critical evaluation in his Politics, analyzing Spartan institutions in relation to broader concepts of governance, justice, and social function. He recognized the advantages of disciplined education and communal cohesion but highlighted structural flaws. Demographic decline, rigid hierarchy, and dependence on a subjugated population posed inherent risks to long-term sustainability. Aristotle's analysis situates Sparta within comparative political theory, identifying both the virtues and limitations of its system. Later, Plutarch, writing in the early imperial period, synthesized previous accounts, blending historical description with moral reflection. His Lives, particularly the biographies of Lycurgus, Leonidas, and other notable figures, emphasize virtue, austerity, and courage, while often employing anecdotal narratives to illustrate institutional principles. Plutarch's portrayal contributed significantly to the enduring cultural image of Sparta as both admirable and austere, shaping interpretations for subsequent generations. These classical perspectives collectively reveal a duality in early Spartan historiography. Authors admired Sparta's discipline, military effectiveness, and social cohesion, yet consistently noted vulnerabilities arising from demographic rigidity, social stratification, and reliance on coerced labor. Archaeological evidence, such as fortifications, hoplite equipment, and urban layouts, corroborates these textual descriptions, confirming the interplay between societal structures and observed outcomes in military and civic life. From an interpretive perspective, these ancient accounts illustrate how historical narrative and cultural perception intersected. Authors selected aspects of Spartan life that suited their analytical, moral, or literary purposes, producing a complex legacy that combined admiration and critique. Understanding this foundation is essential for evaluating how subsequent historiography, cultural representation, and modern scholarship have interpreted Sparta. In conclusion, ancient sources established the dual lens through which Sparta has been perceived: a society of exceptional discipline and cohesion, yet one constrained by rigid social structures and systemic dependencies. These interpretations provided the baseline for later reassessment by Hellenistic, Roman, and modern scholars. Modern scholarship has continued to reassess these early portrayals, integrating archaeological data and critical analysis to form a more nuanced understanding of Sparta's historical reality. In contemporary culture, Sparta often appears more as symbol than historical reality. Sparta's legacy extends far beyond classical scholarship, permeating modern literature, film, political discourse, military culture, and athletics. Popular representations frequently emphasize martial prowess, discipline, and collective heroism, often abstracted from historical context. Hollywood productions, most notably films depicting the Battle of Thermopylae, dramatize Spartan courage and sacrifice, emphasizing cinematic spectacle over nuanced historical accuracy. These portrayals highlight enduring fascination with Spartan militarism while simplifying the complexities of social hierarchy, helot dependence, and political institutions. In political rhetoric, Sparta has served as a symbol of civic virtue, endurance, and state discipline. Figures ranging from Enlightenment philosophers to contemporary commentators have invoked Sparta to exemplify military preparedness, austerity, or collective duty. Such appropriations often extract select features of Spartan society, particularly the agoge and hoplite ethos, while overlooking broader social, economic, and demographic realities. The use of Sparta in this context illustrates how historical memory can be mobilized to serve ideological or pedagogical purposes. Military and athletic institutions similarly engage with Spartan symbolism. Modern armies, cadet programs, and training regimes occasionally reference Spartan discipline and cohesion as aspirational models, framing Spartan society as a template for physical endurance, strategic coordination, and teamwork. In athletics, particularly in endurance competitions and martial arts, the Spartan image conveys notions of resilience and rigor. While these applications draw inspiration from classical sources, they selectively reinterpret Spartan life, emphasizing perceived virtues rather than systemic complexities or ethical considerations, such as the reliance on helot labor. Popular media, including literature, video games, and digital content, has further cemented Sparta as a cultural icon. Graphic narratives, historical fiction, and interactive entertainment often dramatize battles, legendary leaders, and austere lifestyles, reinforcing simplified archetypes of heroism, stoicism, and martial excellence. These interpretations contribute to a collective imagination of Sparta that prioritizes narrative and spectacle over historical fidelity, shaping public understanding through symbolism rather than evidence. From an academic perspective, these modern depictions highlight the distinction between historical reality and cultural mythmaking. While Sparta's classical institutions, social structures, and military achievements remain subjects of rigorous study, popular representations frequently abstract or idealize these features. Recognizing this divergence allows audiences to appreciate Sparta's enduring influence while maintaining a critical perspective grounded in archaeological, textual, and historiographical evidence. In conclusion, Sparta's presence in modern culture functions as a symbol of discipline, courage, and societal cohesion, often divorced from the realities of classical life. These enduring images, while powerful, underscore the importance of distinguishing between historical fact and cultural memory. Sparta, both as a polis and as an idea, continues to shape perceptions of military organization, civic order, and social engineering across centuries. This concludes the long chronological and interpretive arc of Spartan civilization, from its origins in Laconia to its lasting influence on scholarship and culture. If you found this journey through Sparta's rise, power, and enduring legacy insightful, subscribe to continue exploring the histories of the world's greatest civilizations. Don't forget to like and share this documentary, and leave a comment with the next ancient culture or empire you'd like to see explored. For an even deeper experience, watch with headphones and settle in as history unfolds.